She had spent her entire life being invisible, until one night she dared to hide behind a mask. At a glittering masquerade, Lila Fairchild becomes the mysterious woman London cannot stop whispering about, and captures the attention of a duke who is determined to discover her identity. Welcome to the Duke's Mysterious Masquerade, a Regency romance where one secret night could change everything. Your escape into romance awaits. Happy listening. The Duke's Mysterious Masquerade, Chapter 1. If ever a debut could be said to unfold with the unrelenting precision of a military maneuver, Miss Vivian Fairchild's did so on an unseasonably warm April evening, the sort of night when even the stars above Berkeley Square seemed to blink with envy at the profusion of candlelight below. Lila Fairchild, not quite 20, and not quite as invisible as she longed to be, surveyed the proceedings from the calculated safety of her post, precisely 1½ steps behind the ornamental pillar near the French doors, at a vantage that afforded unimpeded views of both the ballroom and any promising escape routes. From this cloistered nook, Lila enjoyed the paradox of being both present and unseen, a phenomenon her mother insisted would guarantee her a husband of at least baronet status, if only she would mingle, dearest, mingle, with a touch less rabbit in the crosshairs in her expression. Vivian, on the other hand, required neither pillars nor ploys. She gleamed. She shimmered. Her laughter, so effortless and light, gilded the air as she presided over her coming-out ball like an empress benevolently permitting her courtiers to worship at her feet. Lila watched as her sister accepted compliments, flirted with conversational restraint, but only just, and graciously tolerated the slavish devotion of half the eligible bachelors in London, none of whom had ever, to Lila's knowledge, risked their composure by proposing a quadrille to her. Lila's mother, resplendent in a gown the colour of optimism and fortified by 3 glasses of champagne, hovered anxiously at the edge of Vivian's orbit. "Darling, perhaps a touch less. Oh, effusion. And a touch more. Oh, never mind. You're perfect," she fretted, dabbing Vivian's already flawless cheek with a lace kerchief. This motherly intervention, Lila noted, was the most in-demand dance of the evening. From the other side of the pillar, Penelope materialized in the ghostly fashion only personal maids of extraordinary discretion could. "You have made yourself scarce, Miss Lila," she murmured, handing her a glass of lemonade that tasted, as always, faintly of Penelope's good intentions. "It is the only military tactic in which I have any skill," Lila replied, though her smile was sincere. "And it keeps mother's guests, from mounting another assault on my posture." Penelope quirked a brow, which was as much laughter as she ever permitted herself while on duty. She scanned the room in a professional sweep. "Miss Vivian appears to be winning the campaign," she noted, eyes flitting to the ring of besotted suitors, and then back to Lila, gently but insistently. "But the Duchess's nephew, the one with the heroic jaw, has not taken his eyes off you since the first waltz." "Which is less testament to my charms than to the horror I inspired by treading on his foot," said Lila. She could still feel the flush that had invaded her cheeks when the waltz began and promptly ended with her on the wrong side of the rhythm. "He looked as though he'd been felled by a gouty uncle." She sipped her lemonade and let her gaze drift upward. The ballroom's ceiling had been painted with clouds and cherubs, but the effect, after a few hours and many more glasses of punch, was less heavenly than it was mildly alarming. The candles, however, were the triumph of the evening. Reflected in gilded mirrors, they shimmered off crystal and gold, off the pearls at Vivienne's throat and the diamonds in Lady Ashcombe's coiffure. They rendered the entire affair a sort of waking dream, albeit one in which the principal dreamer had very little to do. In moments like these, Lila's mind retreated to safer territory. The poetry of observation was her true gift, and she silently composed a few lines as she watched a pair of dowagers, dressed with all the subtlety of royal carriages, collide gently at the refreshment table. Two ships in taffeta, passing in the night, crash bows at port, commence a silent fight. Corsages bristle, battle lines are drawn. The victory not in words, but who stays on? Penelope watched her mistress with the attentive interest of a gardener coaxing a rose to bloom. "You were not always so content to spectate," she said, voice pitched for Lila's ears alone. Lila allowed herself a faint, conspiratorial smile. "One must learn to appreciate one's strengths, Penelope. Mine is camouflage." "And mine is stubbornness." Penelope's lips pressed together, determined. "Which is why I shall fetch you a biscuit, and you will not fade away entirely before midnight." Lila watched her go, affection blooming behind her ribs. Penelope was more than a maid. She was the only soul in the house who ever asked Lila what she actually thought. Even father, were he not entombed in the library with his maps, would have found Lila's preference for the periphery perplexing. On the dance floor, Vivian spun with Lord Merton, whose devotion was matched only by the size of his waistcoat. "He will propose by the end of the month," whispered a nearby matron to her companion, voice like the rustle of silk. "Lord Harrington has no more backbone than blancmange." Lila's mother, perhaps hearing her own name invoked in the conversational melee, materialized by her daughter's side, dabbing at imaginary crumbs on Lila's bodice. "Darling, you must try the ratafia drops. Lady Ashcombe's chef is rumoured to have been kidnapped from the continent. It is all anyone talks about." She glanced, as she always did, at Vivienne before adding, "Vivienne is doing splendidly, is she not? One could scarcely imagine a more perfect debut. Your time will come, darling. You'll see." Lila doubted it, but the words cost her nothing. "Yes, mother." Satisfied, her mother whirled away in a flurry of silk, leaving the scent of roses and anxiety in her wake. The Fairchild family's ballroom had been the envy of London for 3 decades, and tonight it strained under the weight of expectation and guests alike. The men clustered near the gaming tables, the women near whichever source of gossip promised the greatest dividends. Lila's gaze drifted to a group of girls about her own age, perched on a velvet settee and wrapped in the bubble of their own importance. They spoke in stage whispers, voices pitched to ensure accidental overhearing. "Did you hear," said the blondest of them, "about the midnight masquerade?" The others shivered with calculated delight. "My cousin says it is absolutely forbidden," said a redhead with a crescent moon smile. "But the invitations are exquisite. Black wax and a crest I did not recognize. Entirely scandalous. They say unchaperoned young ladies have gone. Alone," said a third, eyes round with both horror and anticipation. Some even returned engaged. Lila's interest, previously more butterfly than hawk, now sharpened. She moved an inch closer, under pretense of refilling her lemonade. The girls' conversation took on the quality of myth, riddled with exaggeration, spiked with the terror of being caught and the thrill of being chosen. They say the hostess is a duchess, or a courtesan, or perhaps both. My cousin claims a famous poet once attended, in disguise. The identity of the Nightingale is the subject of wagers at White's. The Nightingale. Lila rolled the name over in her mind, tasting its drama and mystery. How easy it would be to slip into the skin of such a creature, admired not for obedience or lineage or posture, but for daring, for wit, for saying the things everyone else only thought. It was, perhaps, the most foolish idea to ever take root in her skull, and Lila cherished it instantly. She returned to her post by the pillar and, for once, found the atmosphere lacking. The evening had grown stifling, an endless repetition of dances and introductions, of insipid conversation and the sense of being at once observed and ignored. The prospect of something forbidden, something that would horrify her mother, and perhaps even Vivienne, was intoxicating. Penelope reappeared, biscuit in hand, and eyes bright with amusement. "Eavesdropping, Miss Lila? Shall I fetch you an ear trumpet?" Lila snorted, an unladylike sound she would never make in front of her mother. "You heard them?" "Half the room did. Lady Ashcombe's daughter is determined to be invited." Penelope lowered her voice. "I have it on good authority that the invitations are hand-delivered, by a masked courier." Lila's heart leapt. That cannot be true. Penelope, who could lie as beautifully as she could arrange hair, tilted her head. "It's London, miss. Stranger things have happened." For a moment, Lila allowed herself to imagine it. A letter, black wax, her name written in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. The freedom of a night where no one knew her, where she could reinvent herself entirely, where she could be the Nightingale, or someone even braver. She straightened, surprising herself. "Penelope, if an invitation were to arrive, would you help me?" Penelope's face did not change, but her eyes softened. "There is nothing in this world I would not help you do, Miss Lila. But what will you risk for it?" Lila considered. What would she risk? Her mother's approval, perhaps. Her place in the silent order of the world. But those had never really belonged to her, had they? She squared her shoulders, already feeling lighter. "Everything," she said, and the word thrilled through her. Vivienne's laughter pealed across the room, ringing like a bell. Lila watched her sister, luminous and sure, and did not wish to be her precisely, but wished, with sudden clarity, to be something more than a shadow behind a pillar. The ballroom shimmered on. Lila slipped the biscuit into her reticule and began to plot the most improbable adventure of her life. It was well past 3 in the morning when Lila finally escaped the lingering glitter of the Fairchild ballroom for the quieter dimness of her own sanctuary. Even with the windows thrown open to the April night, the room retained the faint, sweet, sickly residue of roses, candle wax, and the ghost of Vivienne's laughter. Lila suspected that even if she scrubbed the paint from the walls, her sister's presence would cling to the house, and to her, forever. Penelope, ever the silent sentinel, hovered by the hearth with a steaming cup of chocolate. Contraband, for it was meant for the sick room, not sullen debutantes. Lila accepted it with a grateful murmur and slumped onto her window seat, the silk of her gown puddling around her knees. "I nearly wore the soles off my slippers dodging the matrons tonight," she sighed. And for what? To witness Lord Harrington's moustache wilt under the pressure of 3 sets with Vivienne. "Your sister is not as immune to exhaustion as you suppose," Penelope said, gently removing the pins from Lila's hair. "She sent me to ensure you did not drown in your own melancholy." Lila made a face, but allowed the gentle tug of Penelope's hands. It was a small, private comfort, this unspoken ritual of undoing the day. Vivienne could outlast a Parliament filibuster and still look more radiant at dawn than I do after 10 hours' sleep. Penelope was silent, deftly freeing a cascade of curls. Only when she'd loosened the last lock did she speak, her tone feather light. The only difference between you and Miss Vivian is the world's fondness for spotlights. I do not crave a spotlight. Lila's voice caught, betraying her. Just— Penelope knelt so they were eye to eye. Just to be seen. Lila studied the rim of her cup. The words sounded childish, even now, but they hung between them with the weight of confession. Is that so selfish? If it is, the world is full of selfish creatures, Penelope said, and her smile was as old as time. But you have a secret, Miss Lila. You do not desire to be merely seen. You wish to be unforgettable. Lila scoffed, but the notion thudded in her chest. Easier to disappear. At least then I am not compared to Vivian every waking moment. Are you certain? Penelope's gaze was keen. Because tonight I heard something. A song, beneath the noise. You wished to join in, but swallowed the melody. Lila set her cup aside, feeling exposed. Perhaps. But I have neither the voice nor the occasion. Occasion? Penelope repeated, as if testing the word for hidden flavors. What of the midnight masquerade? Lila tried for a derisive laugh, but it sounded more wistful than she intended. Even if such a thing exists, which I doubt, it is not for the likes of me. I would be discovered. And then— She gestured hopelessly at her own small, ordinary frame, at her face scrubbed pink by the night's exertion. Penelope straightened, planting her hands on her hips with a defiance worthy of any general. If you wish to attend, there are ways. I know half the footmen in London, and 2 of the porters at White's. You do not, Lila whispered, scandalized and delighted. I do, Penelope insisted, her eyes twinkling with mischief. And if you truly wished it, I could have you there in a week's time. Masked, anonymous, and if you let me work my miracles, magnificent. Lila let herself imagine it, just for a moment. The thrill of transformation, the decadence of a world where no one knew or expected anything of her. The possibility shimmered, delicate and impossible, and more intoxicating than any champagne. But the old doubts returned, cold and sharp. I would make a fool of myself. Very likely, Penelope agreed, unflinching. But you would also be remembered, which is more than can be said for half the diamonds of the season. And perhaps, just perhaps, you would find someone else who wishes to be seen. Lila frowned. Is that not the goal? To be chosen? Penelope's lips twitched. Or to choose, Miss Lila. I do not think the Nightingale waits for rescuers. She sings her own freedom. Lila stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The moon was out, faint and a bit blurred. In its silver wash, she could almost see the outline of another girl. One who looked like her, but moved differently. A girl who might, for one night, step into the world as a thing of consequence. She turned back to Penelope, heart drumming with possibility and terror. If I were to go, she said slowly, would you help me? Penelope's face broke into the rarest of her smiles, wide and real and unstoppable. You could not stop me. Lila grinned back, all exhaustion forgotten. It would be utterly scandalous. The best adventures are, Penelope said, and began to plot. They spoke in whispers for another hour, hatching details and contingencies. Penelope would wrangle an invitation, procure a mask, and teach Lila to walk and speak as someone whose notice was not an accident, but a certainty. They argued over colours and fabrics, over which shoes would permit the grandest entrance but the quickest escape. Each plan they spun was more daring than the last. and Lila felt the old weight lifting from her shoulders, replaced by a wild, reckless buoyancy. At last, with the sky hinting at dawn, Penelope tucked the covers around her and murmured, "The world will remember you, Miss Lila, for something more than standing behind a pillar." Alone now, Lila watched the night drift into morning. She pressed a hand to her heart and found it still fluttering, not with dread, but anticipation. There was, she realized, a difference between longing to be seen and daring to be known. And if the world's gaze was to find her at the masquerade, she would meet it head-on. Masked, yes, but entirely herself. For the first time in her life, Lila Fairchild did not wish to disappear. She wished, fiercely, to arrive. Chapter 2. It is one thing to vow oneself to adventure in the pre-dawn haze, quite another to greet the promise at midday, when sunlight exposes all of last night's bravado as faintly ridiculous. So it was for Lila Fairchild, who awoke the next morning to find her heart not, as she'd feared, lapsed into decorous retreat, but careening about her ribcage in a fever of anticipation. Penelope was already waiting, a fortress of pins and folded fabric arrayed on the dressing table. "Good morning, Miss Lila," she intoned, the corners of her mouth betraying a smile. "I trust you slept as well as one who is plotting scandal might." "Not at all," Lila said honestly, then, catching Penelope's eye in the mirror, added, "I spent the night rehearsing my confession for when they haul me before the bench at Bow Street." "It will not come to that," Penelope replied, "unless you intend to rob a bishop or propose marriage to a baronet in your cups. Even then, I suspect the magistrate would be charmed." Lila could not help but laugh, though she sobered quickly. "What if I fail? What if someone recognizes me at once, and I am exiled to the wilds of Kent, never to be seen again?" Penelope considered. "It would not be so dreadful, would it? The wilds of Kent are very picturesque." Then, without warning, she fixed Lila with the uncompromising gaze reserved for errant hem-stitches and recalcitrant debutantes. "You have resolved to do this, Miss Lila. Best to begin as you mean to go on, with courage and a well-starched petticoat." Lila nodded, feeling some of the previous night's daring trickle back into her veins. They set to work at once. Penelope produced the dress from an unremarkable chest that Lila had never seen opened in her entire life. The gown was midnight blue, a colour so deep it might have been spun from the sky over the Thames on a cloudless night. Lila reached out, reverently, to touch the fabric. It was lighter than she expected, with a gleam that caught every ray of light. "It belonged to my lady's aunt," Penelope explained, "who had a taste for the dramatic and the means to indulge it. I have refashioned it for you, Miss Lila. See, no one would guess it was not made yesterday, in the very height of Parisian excess." Lila turned it over in her hands, breathless. "It is astonishing." "It is a costume," Penelope said, "and like all costumes, it will transform you, if you permit it." Lila stepped behind the dressing screen and wriggled out of her day dress. As Penelope laced her in, she felt her bones arrange themselves differently, as if her very skeleton were being rewired for bravado. The neckline dipped just low enough to scandalize her mother, and the sleeves, oh, the sleeves, were more art than clothing, floating from the shoulder in froths of silk. Penelope produced a mask next. An intricate confection of blue velvet, stitched with silver thread and trimmed in a fan of dark, iridescent feathers. It was held in place by a slender ribbon, meant to disappear into the hair. Lila examined it with equal parts horror and fascination. "I look like a member of the criminal class," she said. and was surprised to find she liked the idea. "A very elegant criminal," Penelope assured her. "One who steals hearts and perhaps the odd candlestick." Lila put on the mask, tying the ribbon behind her head. It fit perfectly, cupping her cheekbones and narrowing her gaze to something sharp and mysterious. She regarded herself in the mirror and, for a fleeting moment, failed to recognize her own reflection. "Now," Penelope declared, "the most difficult part. You must practice walking as though you expect to be adored." "Impossible," said Lila. But Penelope would not be gainsaid. She lined the floor with handkerchiefs at strategic intervals and instructed Lila to cross the room, head high, as if the handkerchiefs were adoring courtiers rather than pieces of cotton. At first, Lila faltered. She stumbled, nearly treading on a handkerchief, and let out a strangled giggle. "I walk like a chicken in a thunderstorm." "You walk as you have always walked," Penelope corrected. "Try again. Only this time, pretend you are Vivian." Lila rolled her eyes, but she did it. She threw back her shoulders and glided, imagining herself as her sister, the darling of every assembly. With every step, the gown's skirt shimmered around her ankles. With every inhale, the mask forced her to meet her own gaze, unflinching. By the fourth attempt, she found her movements growing more assured, her back straightening almost without conscious effort. "You see," Penelope said, triumphant. "The difference is not in the dress. It is in the intention." Lila paused at the end of her promenade, staring down at her feet. "I suppose the real trick is to believe it, to act as if one belongs, even when one most certainly does not." "That is society in a nutshell," Penelope agreed, her voice softening. "And if you are afraid, remember that every other girl in that ballroom will be just as frightened. The mask is only a mirror." Lila smiled, heart pounding. "Very philosophical for a lady's maid." Penelope shrugged. "We have a great deal of time to think while pressing bodices and mending petticoats." As the afternoon waned, they rehearsed not only posture, but conversation. Penelope adopted the persona of a wealthy but witless marquis, bombarding Lila with questions in a nasal drawl. "And whom do I have the pleasure of addressing, mademoiselle?" Penelope intoned, her lips twitching. Lila hesitated. You may call me the Nightingale." "Charming. Do you often sing at such events?" "Only when bribed handsomely with champagne," Lila said, surprising herself. Penelope clapped her hands. "You are a natural." They ran through dozens of scenarios, each more outlandish than the last. With each iteration, Lila's responses grew quicker, more playful, more daring. By the time darkness crept in through the window, she felt nearly ready, though the prospect of leaving the house in disguise still seemed impossible. Penelope vanished for an hour, returning with a small velvet box and an expression of absolute gravity. She set the box before Lila with a flourish. "For you, Miss Lila." Inside, nestled on a cushion, lay a delicate necklace. Its single stone was the color of stormy seas, faceted to catch the light. "It was my mother's," Penelope said. "She always said it made her brave." Lila's eyes stung. "Penelope, I cannot—" "You must," Penelope insisted, "for luck and for courage." With careful fingers, Lila fastened the necklace. The weight of it pressed reassurance into the hollow of her throat. She stood before the mirror, mask in place, blue gown glowing in the lamplight, and for the first time saw someone she had only ever imagined, the Nightingale, at once herself and something far more. Penelope drew a breath, straightening her own shoulders. It is nearly time. They slipped down the servants' staircase, the house shrouded in the silence peculiar to the hour after dinner, but before midnight. Lila clutched her invitation. Procured, Penelope assured her, through a network of footmen and an undisclosed favour owed to a liveryman at White's. The wax seal glimmered black and sinister in her palm. At the back door, Penelope arranged the final details: the shawl for modesty, the gloves for concealment, and a spare pair of slippers in case the evening turned hazardous. "Will you wait up for me?" Lila whispered, her voice suddenly small. Penelope squeezed her hand. "I will wait until I hear every detail. Now go, before your courage thinks better of it." The street beyond was shockingly empty, the lamplighter just turning in at the end of the row. Lila walked briskly, then boldly, and at last felt herself swept up in the momentum of her own daring. As she approached the carriage Penelope had arranged, she paused for one final breath. The mask itched, the gown pinched, and her heart was one wild drumbeat away from insurrection. But when she stepped inside, she did not do so as Lila Fairchild, the invisible girl behind the pillar. She arrived as the Nightingale, and the city, unwitting and unready, awaited her song. It had not occurred to Lila, until her carriage pulled up to an unmarked townhouse on Half Moon Street, that the phrase "midnight masquerade" might be more literal than poetic. For the lamps along the curb had been doused. The windows above showed nothing but inky panes, and only the faintest glow spilled from a crack in the main door, as though the building itself were trying to keep a secret. The driver, a taciturn man of Penelope's acquaintance, handed Lila down with a courtliness that bordered on conspiratorial. "Good luck, miss," he murmured, before flicking the reins and vanishing into the London gloom. Lila gathered her skirts and approached the door. For one wild moment, she half expected it to swing open of its own accord. Some enchanted portal, attuned to the presence of fledgling adventuresses. Instead, she raised her gloved hand and knocked 3 times, as the invitation instructed. The door opened by mere inches. A masked footman, eyes as expressionless as the blank cards at a gaming table, assessed her with a single glance. "Your invitation, madam." She passed him the card, watching as he examined the black seal, the swirling signature, and the name written not in her own hand, but in Penelope's careful forgery. Mademoiselle Rossignol. He inclined his head and motioned her through. The entryway was lined with silvered mirrors and draped in midnight blue velvet, a corridor designed to heighten the drama of transformation. Lila glimpsed herself in one of the mirrors and nearly laughed. The mask, the dress, the subtle tilt of her chin. She truly looked nothing like Lila Fairchild. She looked, if anything, dangerous. A second footman, this one in a mask shaped like a fox's face, escorted her up a flight of carpeted stairs. At the landing, the air changed. It was warm and thick with the scent of candle wax and roses. Music drifted from somewhere ahead, a stately minuet, muffled and slightly out of time. The fox footman paused before another set of doors, then rapped twice. When the doors opened, Lila was swept into a world that could not possibly exist by daylight. The ballroom had been stripped of all bourgeois respectability and reborn as a temple to excess. Hundreds of candles floated in crystal chandeliers, their flames painting every gold cornice and frieze with fevered light. The walls, hung with mirrors and blue velvet, seemed to multiply the crowd into infinity. A dizzying host of peacocks, harlequins, pirates, and winged sylphs. The sound was a heady swirl. Laughter, the brassy calls of the orchestra, the sharp burst of champagne corks. If the Fairchild Ball had been an exercise in aspiration, this was a kingdom of desire. Lila faltered just inside the threshold, momentarily uncertain whether to advance or retreat. But no one noticed her hesitation. The guests were consumed by their own intrigue, their own performances. A pair of women in butterfly masks whispered behind feathered fans. A domino-masked gentleman trailed a comet of admirers in his wake. In the far corner, a woman dressed as an empress held court atop a throne of embroidered pillows, dispensing caustic judgments and candied violets. Lila exhaled. She could have been anyone, or no one at all. It was exquisite. She drifted into the crowd, drawn first by curiosity, then by a sort of greedy hunger to see and be seen. Every few steps, someone would pause to study her mask, nod in silent recognition, then glide on. She returned the glances with increasing boldness, marveling at the invisibility afforded by disguise. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded richer, smoother. Her posture had improved by sheer force of adrenaline. Within minutes, she was hailed by a young man in a clockwork owl mask, who offered her champagne and, with playful solemnity, recited a sonnet about the dangers of mysterious birds at midnight. Lila replied with an impromptu verse of her own, shaky, yes, but daring, and watched as the man's expression shifted from amused to genuinely impressed. "You are not what you seem," he said. "Neither are you," she answered, and left him blinking in her wake. She made 3 circuits of the ballroom, gathering the currency of gossip, before a stir at the head of the room drew everyone's attention. A figure appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase, tall, clad in severe black, face obscured by a mask of onyx and silver. He descended in measured, unhurried strides, the very image of command. She did not need a herald to know him. She had grown up on whispered stories of the Duke of Ravensshire, whose parties were legend and whose reputation, depending on which dowager one asked, was either irreproachable or irredeemable. He paused at the foot of the staircase, surveying the crowd with a detachment that bordered on predatory. When his gaze swept over Lila, she felt the jolt in her knees, like the prelude to a particularly ill-advised swoon. Their eyes, his, glacial blue behind the black, locked for a fraction of a second. He smiled, a fleeting, wolfish thing, then vanished into the throng. For the next hour, Lila did what she had come to do. She played the Nightingale. She danced with a philosopher disguised as Mephistopheles, debated politics with a bishop's daughter in a domino, and waged a duel of compliments with a woman she recognized, dimly, as Lady Ashcombe's eldest. Though the lady wore a mask of swan's down and a gown that would have scandalized all of Mayfair. She drank another glass of champagne, then another, delighting in the strange effervescence of her own audacity. Only once did her courage falter. She caught a glimpse of herself in a passing mirror, and, for a moment, the mask seemed to slip. Beneath the painted feathers and bright eyes, she saw Lila Fairchild, not a nightingale, but a very frightened girl pretending at bravery. The illusion wobbled. She nearly fled. But then a hand caught hers, warm, assured, and gloved in the finest kid. "You have an air of flight about you," said a voice, low and unmistakably amused. "Are you so soon ready to leave?" Lila turned, finding herself face to mask with the Duke of Ravensshire. He was taller than she imagined. His hair was dark, his mask severe, but the lines at the corners of his eyes suggested a wickedness at odds with his severe dress. He held her hand a moment longer than propriety allowed, then released it with a practiced bow. "My lord," Lila managed, defaulting to the safety of formality. He grinned. You needn't use titles tonight. No one does. I confess, I have been trying to decide what to call you. She tilted her chin, emboldened by the mask and the memory of Penelope's coaching. I have an invitation that names me Mademoiselle Rossignol, but I suppose you may call me what you wish, so long as you do not guess at my real name. He arched a brow, feigning disappointment. A challenge, then. I accept. She had not meant to flirt, but the words had left her before she could stop them. It was oddly liberating. He gestured to the dance floor. Will you dance with me, Miss Rossignol? She hesitated, then nodded. As they moved into the figures of the waltz, Lila felt the press of his hand on her back. A steadying pressure, equal parts comfort and demand. The music swelled, the candles shimmered, and for the first time in her life, she did not have to measure her steps against Vivian or anyone else. The Duke was an exceptional partner, precise, attentive, and, she suspected, deliberately testing her with sudden flourishes and reversals. She matched him, step for step. Halfway through the dance, he leaned in, close enough that his words vibrated against the shell of her ear. You dance as if you wish to be seen. She surprised herself. Only by those who are watching. He laughed, a real laugh, not the brittle sort men deployed for effect. And if I said I was watching? Then I suppose I must dance all the better, Lila replied. Their movements grew faster, more daring, the boundary between them dissolving with each turn. She forgot herself, forgot her name, her place, even the lurking terror that the night would end and she would be found out. In the Duke's arms, she was not a wallflower. She was a force, a presence. When the waltz ended, he did not release her hand at once. You are nothing like the rest of them. On the contrary, my lord, she said, I am exactly like the rest. I merely wear a different sort of mask. He smiled, slow and considering. Perhaps, but I suspect the mask fits you less well than you think. She ought to have been mortified by the implication, but instead she felt giddy, almost drunk on the possibility that someone had looked past the feathers and found the person beneath. They drifted to the edge of the floor. A servant appeared, silent as a rumour, and offered a tray of lemon tarts. The Duke selected two and handed one to her, the gesture intimate in a way that made her pulse leap. Tell me, Miss Rossignol, he said, why does a woman of such obvious wit and charm choose to hide her face at a masquerade? She considered. Perhaps I grow bored of being overlooked. He studied her a long moment. I cannot imagine you overlooked. She shrugged, though the motion felt unfamiliar in the strange, powerful skin of the Nightingale. It is easier than you think. A shadow passed over his eyes. Easier, perhaps, than being constantly in view. She wondered at that, whether he meant himself or someone else, or whether all of society was a theatre of masks with no audience but each other. They stood in companionable silence, nibbling lemon tarts and watching the revellers whirl past in a storm of colour and feathers. At some point, Lila realised the party had begun to wind down. The musicians' notes turned languid. The masks sagged at the edges. The night was running out. The Duke, sensing her melancholy, bent closer. Stay a while longer. It will be dawn soon, and reality has a terrible way of spoiling things. She looked up at him, searching for a trace of artifice or insincerity, and found none. You are not what I expected. Nor are you, he said, with an honesty that startled her. The last dance began. The Duke led her out once more, and they spun through the closing measures together, breathless and certain that the world, at least for one night, belonged to them. When it ended, the crowd melted away, the magic receding with the darkness. Lila, masked and giddy, took her leave, declining the Duke's offer of escort with a mysterious smile. It would ruin the mystery, she told him, and meant it. She found her way to the street alone, the mask warm on her face and her skin tingling with the memory of his hands. The carriage was waiting. As Lila climbed inside, she turned for one last look at the shuttered townhouse, now dark and ordinary as any other. But she knew, as surely as she knew her own heart, that she would never again be merely Lila Fairchild. She was the Nightingale, and she could not wait to see what song she might sing next. Chapter 3. For all the epics extolling the glories of a London sunrise, none dared describe its wretched effect on a debutante returning home in last night's slippers, reeking faintly of champagne and criminal intent. Lila Fairchild clung to the shadowed wall of her own house, toes already numb, as Penelope, general, smuggler, lady's maid, surveyed the enemy territory. "You have precisely 3 minutes before the scullery maids wake to start the porridge?" Penelope whispered, gripping Lila by the elbow. "If you value your virtue, your reputation, or even your shoes, do not make a sound until I give the all clear." "Do you suppose the windows are alarmed?" Lila whispered back, half in jest. Penelope snorted. "Miss Lila, the only thing alarming about these windows is how long it takes to clean them. Go." She went, up the back staircase, ducking beneath a phalanx of drying linens, through a corridor scented with beeswax and defeat. The familiar terrain now seemed fraught with peril. Every step a thunderclap, every creak a shot across the bow. At the landing, Lila's pulse crashed against her ears as she caught the distant shudder of Mother's door, that haunted hinge which squeaked only at moments of greatest disaster. Penelope pressed her forward with unyielding hands. They made the final sprint for Lila's chamber, dodging a servant girl armed with a tray of tea and a look that suggested she'd seen plenty, but valued her place more than her curiosity. Safe at last in her sanctuary, Lila staggered to the bed and collapsed, the borrowed blue gown fanned around her like a velvet pool. She buried her face in the coverlet, stifling a laugh and a sob in equal measure. Penelope closed the door, then drew the curtains to hush the sun's inquisition. She peeled Lila from the gown, shushed her protests, and began the laborious process of returning her to a state befitting a young lady presumed never to have left her bed. "Was it worth it?" Penelope murmured, undoing the mask's knotted ribbon. Lila grinned through tangled hair. "I would brave 1,000 garden hedges and 10 times as many candles to do it again." Penelope's smile was a silent benediction. She worked briskly, sponging the traces of excitement from Lila's cheeks and coiling her hair into a sleep-mussed coronet. "It's a pity you can't nap until noon." The warning, when it came, was a mere flick of Penelope's eyes toward the door. With the speed of an urchin eluding the beadle, Lila scrambled beneath the counterpane, barely breathing. She closed her eyes and assumed the pose of one who had slept like a model daughter, though her heart continued to riot beneath the quilt. The door swung open. Lila heard the stately tread of her mother and braced for the inevitable. "Lila, darling," came the expected croon, as syrupy as the strawberry preserves she ladled at breakfast. "Are you awake, precious?" Lila forced a groggy moan, practiced in 100 similar campaigns. "Mmph." Lady Fairchild tutted. "No doubt up late with your journals again?" If only you took after Vivian in her commitment to early hours. A faint shudder of guilt? No, not guilt. Something closer to panic rippled through Lila as she recalled the journals. Had she left one on the windowsill, or— She dared not look. Rise and shine, her mother continued, and do wear something with a bit of cheer. Lady Ashcombe's garden breakfast is the affair of the week, and it would do you good to be seen. Vivienne is quite the rage. We must not seem to be hiding you. Lila considered that she had, in fact, spent the night hiding, but let the irony pass without comment. She muttered a sound which could have meant anything from "I live to serve" to "death would be preferable." Her mother swept out, satisfied, and Penelope slipped back in, armed with hot tea and a look of immense amusement. "I suspect you could manage breakfast with the Prince Regent and not betray a thing," she said, eyes twinkling. "Thank you, Penelope. Next time, perhaps the Prince. I expect he'd like the gown." They fell into their morning routine, and Lila let the warmth of the tea chase away the last shreds of terror. She thought, as Penelope laced her into her day dress, a pale butter yellow, insipid and inoffensive, how little anything in her life had changed, and yet how much she had. The Nightingale's mask was gone, but something inside her sang still. In the breakfast room, the Fairchilds sat like pieces on a chessboard, each fulfilling a role so practiced it had lost all meaning. Mother at the head, plotting strategies of social advancement. Vivienne, resplendent even in her casual morning muslin, surveying the newsprint for items of self-interest. Father, stoically barricaded behind his copy of the Times, possibly asleep, possibly dead. Lila slid into her chair, greeted by the half-smile of her mother and the not-quite-smile of her sister. "Good morning," she said, testing the waters. Vivienne raised a brow. "You look exhausted, dear. Did the excitement of my triumph keep you tossing all night?" "Perhaps it was your own snoring," Lila offered sweetly. "I thought a cattle market had set up in the street." Vivienne snorted, and even Mother deigned to smile. "We must be on our best form today," Lady Fairchild intoned. "Rumour has it the Duke of Ravenshire will attend. You know how rare that is." Lila nearly choked on her toast. "The— who?" "The Duke, darling. If only your father possessed such a sense of duty to his title." Mother sniffed, eyeing father, who betrayed no reaction. Lila let the information settle, remembering the figure at the masquerade, commanding, mysterious, more legend than man. She had seen him, spoken to him, danced with him. The memory was both mortifying and intoxicating. Vivienne, as if reading her thoughts, added, "I do hope he favours masked balls over tedious breakfasts. Otherwise he may expire before noon." Lila bit the inside of her cheek, hard. They discussed the usual run of topics. Who had been seen with whom? Which families had suffered reversals or windfalls? Which gowns had already been copied, and by which inferior modistes? Lila watched her family perform these rituals and felt herself growing more and more translucent, as if her very essence had been used up by the prior night's adventure. It was a sensation both terrifying and, in a perverse way, freeing. Penelope appeared, wordless, to refresh Lila's tea. Their eyes met for a split second. Penelope's glance sly, encouraging, and not a little proud. After the meal, Lila retreated to her favourite haunt, a window seat overlooking the back garden, where she could read or write or simply watch the world go by. She tried to summon the courage to record last night's events, but the memory felt too precious to risk on paper. Instead, she pressed her forehead to the glass and let the morning sun burn a path across her eyelids. She wondered what the Duke made of her, if he remembered her at all. If he, too, lay in his bed at dawn and tried to reconcile the person he was with, the person he wished to become. She doubted it, but the possibility made her heart skip a beat. Elsewhere, at the very edge of Mayfair's respectable geography, the Duke of Ravenshire paced the perimeter of Lady Ashcombe's gardens with all the vigour of a man who would rather be anywhere else. It was said that Alexander Ravenshire wore his boredom like a cloak, shedding it only for war, scandal, or rare moments of genuine amusement. Today, he found himself unequipped for any of the three. "I declare, Ravenshire, you have not heard a word I've said," Lord Julian Ashcombe complained, trailing after him like a spaniel in pursuit of a biscuit. The Duke did not pause. "You have been discussing the merits of Mrs. Harding's gooseberry tart for nearly 7 minutes. I assure you, I absorbed the salient points." Julian flapped a hand. "No, prior to that. The masquerade. The creature in the blue mask. My sources say you barely left her side." Ravenshire shot him a look. "Your sources are imprecise. I left her side at least twice. Once to retrieve a drink, once to retrieve her from the clutches of an over-eager Medici." Julian's eyes gleamed. "You are obsessed, my friend. It is delicious." Ravenshire frowned, then relented. "She was not what I expected." "Nor, I gather, what you wanted to expect. The ineffable Nightingale. There are wagers at White's as to her true identity." "Let them wager," Ravenshire muttered. "She will outwit them all." They rounded a rose arbour, where a cluster of ladies pretended not to eavesdrop as they admired a display of imported tulips. Ravenshire nodded at the nearest, prompting a round of nervous curtsies. Julian, never one to pass up an audience, announced, "The Duke is in love, but won't admit it." A sigh, as collective as it was mournful, passed through the rose arbour. The Duke ignored it. Julian fell into step beside him. "Have you considered the possibility she's a notorious criminal, come to seduce the highest in the land, and then abscond with your fortune?" "I have considered every possibility," Ravenshire said, his voice dry, "including that she is a particularly clever debutante with a penchant for mischief." Julian grinned. "And you like her all the more for it?" Ravenshire offered no reply. He stopped at the far end of the garden, gazing back at the house. "It is infuriating," he confessed, low enough that only Julian could hear. "She could be anyone. She could be here now, laughing at me." "She could also be married," Julian pointed out. "Or a governess. Or a spy." The Duke smiled despite himself. "If she is a spy, she deserves the empire." The two men stood in companionable silence. The garden shimmered under the weight of late morning sun, every blade of grass perfectly trimmed, every blossom arranged for optimal admiration. But Ravenshire's mind spun elsewhere, across velvet ballrooms and the memory of a hand in his, light as a promise and twice as dangerous. "I will find her," he said quietly, more to himself than to Julian. Julian's tone softened. "And if you do?" Ravenshire hesitated. "I suppose I must decide whether to expose her or join her in the adventure." Julian laughed. "You have never sounded more like a man about to do something truly idiotic." "Then let us pray I do it with style," the Duke replied. They moved off, leaving the garden to the bees and the gossiping matrons. Back in her window seat, Lila dozed, drifting in and out of dreams that were part memory and part wish. She heard the echo of a waltz, the taste of lemon and champagne on her tongue, and always, at the periphery, the challenge of his blue gaze. She woke to the sound of Vivienne, humming as she arranged flowers in the sitting room, and the reality of her own, pale reflection in the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of blue, the mask, come to haunt her. But it was only the sky, impossibly bright and open. She smiled, and let herself imagine a future where she might step into that light, unmasked and unafraid. But for now, it was enough to know that somewhere in London the Nightingale had been seen and remembered, and that she was not alone in her longing for more. Lady Ashcombe's garden, reputed for the perfection of its roses and the ferocity of its social jousts, was by noon transformed into a battlefield of wit and frippery. The air was thick with the scent of peonies and lemon biscuits, and even thicker with the unspoken hope of mothers everywhere that their daughters might, by accident or design, catch the eye of an eligible peer. Lila Fairchild, in a dress the precise shade of surrender, positioned herself as close to invisible as possible. She chose the far end of the terrace, partly shaded by a venerable linden, and observed the parade of bonnets and parasols with all the studied detachment of a naturalist examining foreign fauna. It was astonishing, really, that after a single night of adventure, she could never again be satisfied with ordinary daylight. Every giggle seemed shriller, every compliment more hollow. The games of the drawing room, once the entirety of her world, now appeared like a poorly rendered scene behind a gauze curtain. She watched Vivienne glide from circle to circle, followed by her pack of acolytes, each one vying for a laugh or a touch, while the gentlemen trailed in her wake as though she were some comet, and they the lesser stars. Today's object of universal fascination, however, was not Vivienne. It was the Duke. He stood on the lawn, handsome as a Byronic villain, a constellation of lesser men orbiting him as if compelled by some irresistible gravitational pull. Even at a distance, he radiated the same aloof confidence as at the Masquerade, though, Lila noted with a secret thrill, he did not seem at ease. He was searching. It was obvious to her, if not to anyone else. His eyes flicked over the garden with a restless hunger, pausing only when some unfamiliar face or particularly absurd hat caught his attention. Whenever a guest's laughter rose above the rest, he would turn, expectant, then disappointed. More than once, Lila caught him staring into space, as if mentally conjuring the apparition of a girl in a blue mask. She wondered whether he would recognize her, stripped of all artifice. She rather doubted it. The Nightingale had been all confidence and allure, while Lila, in the daylight, was merely Lila. A shadow blocked her view. Penelope, bearing a tray of cold lemonade, set it before her with the studied deference of a maid who understood the need for both discretion and hydration. "Have you spotted him, Miss Lila?" Penelope whispered, not bothering to name the object of interest. "He's looking for someone," Lila replied. Penelope arched a brow. "Not you, I trust?" Lila almost laughed. "Not in the least. I am invisible as ever." Penelope's lips twitched. Invisible, perhaps. Unnoticed? Never. She left Lila to her surveillance, vanishing with the precision of a seasoned conspirator. The afternoon wore on in a series of staged amusements. A bout of shuttlecock, a poetry reading beneath the arbour, which devolved into chaos when a bee menaced the participants, and a contest to name the rarest flower. Through it all, Lila drifted at the edges, neither fully present nor truly absent. She intercepted gossip about last night's ball. Who had fainted? Who had flirted? who had made the best impression on the eligible men of London, and felt herself receding further into memory, until Vivienne, resplendent in lavender, commandeered her arm and steered her toward the refreshments with a grip worthy of a prizefighter. "Lila, do try to at least pretend enjoyment. Mother will have apoplexy if you spend another hour in the shrubbery." "I was merely admiring the gladiolus," Lila said, which was technically true. Vivienne rolled her eyes, though not unkindly. "The Duke of Ravenshire has been watching you." "He has not," Lila retorted, a little too quickly. Vivienne's expression sharpened. "He has. I've seen it. You ought to capitalize." "I think you mean you ought to capitalize," Lila replied, but the accusation held little venom. Vivienne's face softened. "Perhaps I do. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't. You're clever enough for both of us, even if you persist in hiding it." For a moment, Lila almost confessed everything, about the masquerade, the dance, the conversation that still echoed in her chest. But then the memory of his blue eyes, searching and not finding her, made her bite back the words. They reached the lemonade table, and Vivienne's attention was quickly usurped by a pair of exquisitely boring baronets, leaving Lila blessedly alone. Until, inevitably, he appeared. The Duke of Ravenshire materialized at her elbow with no more warning than a shift in the quality of the sunlight. Up close, he seemed taller, his presence almost a physical force. He inclined his head, a gesture precise enough to be mocking. "Miss Fairchild, I presume?" Lila started, composure slipping. "Your Grace." "I trust you enjoyed last night's assembly?" he asked, voice low and unreadable. She considered her reply. "It was unlike any I have attended." His mouth quirked. "I am told the best assemblies always are." He lingered, as if waiting for her to say something further, but Lila could think of nothing that would not betray her secret. For a terrible instant, she was certain he could see right through her, see the wildness beneath the demure yellow muslin, the echo of the nightingale in her eyes. But the moment passed. The Duke glanced over her shoulder, then back at her, suddenly distracted. "Have we met before?" he asked, searching her face. Lila's throat tightened. "I do not believe so, Your Grace." He accepted the lie with a frown, then offered her the faintest of smiles. "You remind me of someone," he said. She felt the world tilt, just a little. "Perhaps I have one of those faces?" "Perhaps." His gaze lingered, sharp as ever. "Do you care for poetry, Miss Fairchild?" The question startled her. Yes, very much." He nodded. "I thought so." Then, with a polite bow, he vanished, leaving Lila torn between relief and disappointment. She found Penelope waiting in the shade, folding napkins into origami swans. "He spoke to you," Penelope said, not a question. "He did. He asked if I liked poetry." "And do you?" Lila's mouth twisted. "Not at the moment." Penelope suppressed a laugh, then leaned in. "He is looking for you, you know." "He is looking for the Nightingale," Lila corrected. "He does not know what he's looking for, only that she is not here." Penelope shrugged. "You cannot be two people forever." "Why not? Everyone else manages it." Penelope's eyes softened. "Perhaps. But most people do not mind so much when no one sees the real one." Lila looked across the garden, where the Duke stood surrounded by admirers, his gaze already wandering. Maybe I wish to be seen only by those who matter, she said. Penelope tucked a wayward curl behind Lila's ear. Then you must decide which of you matters most. The rest of the afternoon blurred together. The polite laughter, the forced merriment, the dull ache of knowing that she could never again be content with half a life. Lila played her role to perfection, smiling when expected, retreating when possible, holding tight to the secret that she had once, for one night, been unforgettable. As the sun dipped behind the hedges, she caught one final glimpse of the Duke. He stood apart, face turned to the sky, the angle of his jaw betraying something raw and unsettled. In that instant, Lila realized they were more alike than she had ever imagined. Two souls searching for something only they could name. She left the garden quietly, her slippers soaked with dew, and returned home through the back gate, where Penelope awaited with a candle and a knowing smile. "Well?" Penelope asked, leading her up the stairs. "Well, what?" "Did he see you, Miss Lila?" Lila thought of his eyes, sharp and curious, his voice, velvet and challenging, the way he had almost, but not quite, recognized her. She smiled, tired and full of longing. "He saw enough," Lila said. And for now, that was all she dared to want. Chapter 4. No one warned Lila Fairchild that a single night of infamy could prove more addictive than laudanum. By the following Thursday, she found herself so starved for the wild permission of the masquerade that even the word itself, masquerade, set her pulse thudding. Her hands itched not for embroidery or French verbs, but for the rough edge of a secret and the slither of a mask's ribbon against her skin. The plan had been to wait a month, perhaps even a season, before returning. Decency required at least that much caution. But decency, as Penelope liked to remind her, was for those whose souls had not been rewired by midnight. So it was that Lila awoke, not with the hangover of regret her mother had so confidently predicted, but with a reckless new hunger. She arrived in Penelope's tiny attic room 2 hours before her next lesson with the French master, clutching a scrap of silk and a glint in her eye that set Penelope instantly on alert. "Is it urgent, or merely impossible?" Penelope inquired, prizing the scrap from Lila's grip and holding it up to the grey morning light. "Both," said Lila, "and also blue." Penelope examined the fabric. It was a scandalous, iridescent peacock shade, hardly fit for any lady this side of Covent Garden. "We could fashion a fan from this, but it would be the undoing of you if your mother discovered it." "That's rather the point," Lila said, unrepentant. "I wish for something unignorable." Penelope pressed her lips together, failing to suppress a smile. "You will have the entire city talking. Only the half that matters." The transformation this time was less about disguise and more about declaration. Where the first Nightingale had crept into existence from scraps and whispers, this one would burst forth as a dare to anyone who cared to watch. Penelope set to work, her needle darting and biting at the silk with the precision of a fencing master. Lila hovered, alternately bouncing on her toes and reading aloud a sonnet about forbidden pleasures, to which Penelope contributed a droll couplet about the perils of sartorial ambition. By evening, the house was abuzz with rumours of a fresh scandal. A minor baron caught in flagrante with his own footman, a debutante found snogging a haberdasher's apprentice. But Lila found herself only faintly interested. Her mind spun instead around the problem of the Duke. She had not seen him since the garden breakfast, but he haunted the pages of the morning papers and the waking dreams of half the girls in Mayfair. Lila tried, and failed, to imagine him reading the society column with even a flicker of interest, but she did imagine him at the next masquerade. Tall, remote, and perhaps a little less composed than before. She told herself it was curiosity, not longing. The appointed night arrived, crisp and electric. Penelope had procured the invitation herself, delivered not by a courier, but by a florid bouquet of midnight roses, their petals ink-black and dangerous. The address was different. A townhouse reputed to have belonged to a notorious Italian countess, and now leased, whispered the gossips, by an heiress too rich and too eccentric for ordinary society. Getting out of the house required only the faintest hint of a sick headache and a single, well-placed tear. Lady Fairchild was so gratified to have Lila abed by sunset that she entirely missed the further absence of her daughter after 10. Lila travelled through the night in a hired coach, swaddled in a cloak lined with the forbidden blue. At the curb, Penelope handed her down and fussed over the tilt of her mask, the lustre of her gloves, and the precise arrangement of the scandalous accessory, a peacock feather, wired cunningly to sweep upward like a coronet of pride. "Are you nervous?" Penelope asked, voice low. Lila flexed her gloved fingers, then set her chin. "I am." "Exalted." Penelope beamed. "Then sing, Nightingale." Inside, the effect was immediate and total. The hallway shimmered with candlelight, and the air was redolent with hyacinth, cinnamon, and the sweet violence of alcohol. Lila's mask was less shield and more spotlight now. Wherever she moved, heads turned, and conversations ceased for a moment before doubling in intensity. A cluster of costumed guests near the entry parted for her as if she were royalty. She drifted into the room, finding her stride, no, her glide, assured and deliberate. No more hugging the pillars or scurrying behind potted palms. Tonight, she walked in the centre. The ballroom throbbed with possibility. Every surface glittered with mirrors or gold. Every guest clad in some riotous invention of silk, velvet, or, in one daring case, little more than cleverly arranged feathers. The orchestra played a set of waltzes so scandalously fast that the dancers verged on indecent. A woman in a fox's mask accosted Lila within 5 minutes. "Is it you?" the fox demanded, voice sharp with excitement. "The Nightingale? The one who bested Lord Montague at charades?" Lila demurred with a coy tilt of her head. "One can never be sure who one is at a masquerade." The fox laughed. "They say you scandalized the Duke himself last time, that he's made a wager to unmask you." "Who is they?" Lila asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, everyone," Foxy replied, and vanished in a spill of orange skirts. Over the next half hour, Lila gathered the intelligence that the Nightingale was now the central myth of the club. One gentleman swore she was the love child of a Russian princess and a pirate. Another insisted she was a widow of some notoriety, come to London to seduce a fortune. Several simply refused to believe she was anyone at all, but a professional actress hired to lend excitement to the proceedings. Lila listened to each theory, offering an enigmatic smile, and tried not to think what her mother would make of it. It took her longer to spot the Duke. He arrived late, alone, and with no visible effort to conceal himself. A black domino mask, a coat tailored within an inch of legal decency, and an air of such calm self-possession that he might as well have been hosting the event. She watched him greet the hostess, a woman in a Venetian border who might have been Lady Ashcombe, or might have been her mortal enemy. The layers of subterfuge were exquisite, before moving through the crowd with a kind of predatory ease. Every so often his gaze would flick across the room, skimming the surface of every face, every mask, until it found her. This time, she did not look away. He crossed the ballroom to her with the deliberation of a man about to interview his own assassin. "Nightingale," he said, bowing over her hand, though etiquette demanded nothing so formal in such a place. "Your Grace," she replied, barely above a whisper, though her heart was louder than the music. "You have outdone yourself," he murmured, and there was a warmth to the words that made her skin prickle. "If my first impression was sharp, I must now confess you are sharper still." "A sharper impression or a sharper person?" He considered her. "Both, perhaps, but especially the latter." Around them, the dance swirled in eddies of colour and motion, but Lila felt as though the entire house had come to rest, waiting on their next word. "You have become the subject of legend," the Duke said. "Every man and half the women here have placed a bet on your true identity. May I ask what you think of that?" She was ready. "I think it is a relief," she said, "to be the subject of legend for once, and not the object of disappointment." He smiled, not the wolfish, predatory sort, but something rueful. "You surprise me. Do you wish to unmask me?" He lifted her gloved hand to his lips, a feather's touch of chivalry. "Only if you wish to be unmasked." She shook her head, a cascade of peacock blue. "Not yet." He laughed then, and she felt the tightness in her chest uncoil. "Then you must allow me a dance," he said. "I have been practicing." "Is that a promise? Or a threat?" "An invitation," he replied. She accepted and allowed herself to be swept onto the dance floor, certain of nothing except the unshakable feeling that she was, at last, exactly where she wanted to be. It was the most glorious waltz of her life. The Duke danced with perfect command, but never steered or led her so much as collaborated. Every turn was an agreement, every step a negotiation. She marvelled at how much could be said through movement, how he invited her to dare, to risk, to show off, and how she met each invitation with a slightly bolder answer than the last. "You are more dangerous than anyone in this room," he said, low enough for her alone. "And yet, here you are," she countered, "dancing with the villain." He grinned. "I was warned about you, you know. At least 3 dowagers have said you will be the undoing of all England's best men." "They overestimate my ambition," she whispered. "I require only one." She regretted it the instant it left her lips, too forward, too real. But the Duke merely tightened his hand on her waist, just for a moment, just enough to make her blood sing. Afterwards, they walked together to the edge of the ballroom. The night air streamed in from a set of French doors, and Lila felt herself both light and invincible. "Would you care for some air?" the Duke asked, offering his arm. "I should warn you," she replied, "that fresh air can be the most dangerous thing of all." He smiled. "I am willing to risk it." They stepped out into the shadowed terrace, and for a moment Lila thought she might float away altogether. But she did not. She stood on the stone, drew in the scent of spring and tobacco and stars, and waited to see what might happen next. The terrace was empty, save for them, and for the candles, scores of them, set into glass hurricanes and tucked between pots of narcissus and sweet alyssum. The air shimmered with the kind of expectancy usually reserved for final acts or first kisses. Lila, who had never before found herself alone with a man past midnight, unless one counted her father, asleep and snoring, was absurdly aware of every sensation: the cool stone against her slippers, the wild chase of her heart, the very slight tremble in her gloved hands. The Duke leaned against the balustrade, not quite facing her, his silhouette outlined by the city's ambient glow. "You know," he said, after a silence measured in heartbeats, "I had planned to confront you, or at least to unmask you, but now I find myself reluctant to do either." Lila crossed her arms, both to steady herself and to suggest confidence she no longer possessed. "Do you not crave the satisfaction of solving the puzzle?" He glanced at her, blue eyes ice clear and unreadable behind his mask. "I once believed so, but I have come to prefer the puzzle to the solution. Perhaps you simply enjoy not knowing." "Perhaps I enjoy knowing just enough." He hesitated, as if searching for a phrase in a language he only half spoke. "You remind me of someone I used to be. Before." She waited, but he did not elaborate. "Before you became a duke, you mean?" He nodded, mouth twisting in self-mockery. "Before I became anyone at all. There was a time when I thought to live in books, not in expectation." She could not help but smile. "Was it poetry or mathematics?" "Neither," he said. "I studied classics, imagined myself another Cicero, dazzling the house with my oratory. I never expected to inherit." A pause, then, "I suspect you never expected to end up here either?" Lila startled. "You know nothing of me." "I know only that the girl who stood in the corner at the Ashcombe garden was not the one who danced with me tonight. I know you wear your mask more comfortably than most wear their faces." She bit back a retort. "Perhaps the mask is easier." "Is it?" He straightened, closing the distance between them by slow increments. "Easier or safer?" Lila exhaled, the sound feather-light. "Does it matter?" "Only if you wish to be seen." He was too close now, by regulation, by etiquette, by whatever invisible line her mother had drawn for her at birth. She could smell the faintest note of clove and something darker, see the shadow of stubble on his jaw. If she reached out, she could touch him. She almost wanted to. She forced herself to turn away, tracing the curve of the balustrade with one hand. Below, the city was a string of lanterns and restless secrets. "I never meant to be seen," she said, not truly. "Liar," the Duke replied, almost tender. She should have been insulted, but instead she felt the splinter of truth. How much she longed for someone to look past the trappings and notice the inconvenient, yearning self she spent all her days concealing. He reached for her then, not to seize or demand, but to steady, a hand hovering at her elbow, a presence rather than a possession. "Why do you do it?" he asked, quiet. "Come here. Risk all this?" She thought of her mother, of Vivienne, of the endless treadmill of rehearsed phrases and measured smiles. She thought of her secret notebooks and her desperate, childish desire to matter. "Because for one night, I am not someone's sister or someone's disappointment. I am only myself." He breathed out, and the sound held both admiration and sorrow. "You are more than yourself," he said. "You are—" He stopped, uncertain. "A legend," she offered, teasing. He shook his head. "A truth no one else will admit." They stood in the hush of that for a while, the city murmuring below. "Will you tell me who you are?" he asked at last. She looked up, daring him. "Would you believe me if I did?" "I believe everything you say, and nothing at all," he confessed. She was laughing then, but it was a tremulous laugh, threaded with nerves. "You are very dangerous, Your Grace." "Only to you?" "Only to me," she agreed, And suddenly it was not a game, not even a little. He brushed a gloved knuckle against her cheek, a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental, but both of them knew better. "If you were anyone else," he said, voice nearly breaking, "I would kiss you now." Her own voice was barely audible. "And if I were myself?" He did not answer, but leaned in, so close she could feel his breath. She thought he might close the gap, that she might let him. Instead, just as the world seemed to shrink to the space between their lips, Lila startled, backed away, gasping. "I cannot," she said. "I am—" He caught her wrist, not hard, but enough to anchor her. "You are afraid." She nodded, and he let go. She stepped back, nearly tripping on her own hem. "I must go." He bowed, not mocking, not even a little. "Will I see you again?" he asked, words rough with hope. She managed a smile. "I think you are very likely to try." And then she was gone, down the terrace, through the candle-lit corridor, back into the madness of the ballroom. She did not pause, not even to gather herself, until she had found the farthest corner and braced her arms on a marble-topped table. Her heart was a wild thing, trying to break free. She touched her mask, uncertain whether to remove it or clutch it tighter. Across the terrace, the Duke remained at the rail, watching the moon drift behind a cloud. He pressed his hand to the balustrade, letting the stone bite into his palm, and forced himself to remain very, very still. He had never met anyone quite like her. He was, he realized, not only obsessed, but undone. He would move heaven and earth, or at least the entirety of London, to find her again. But not tonight. Tonight, he would let the legend grow. Chapter 5. 3 days had passed since the masquerade, and Lila Fairchild had not slept for longer than an hour at a stretch. By day, her mind wandered in circles, never far from the moment on the terrace. His blue gaze, the warmth of his hand, the words she still turned over in her memory, as one might worry a coin between anxious fingers. At night, she found herself at the window, clutching a shawl about her shoulders as though the east wind could blow the memory away. It never did. The city outside was indifferent, but she, Lila, was changed. Not in any way visible to the eye. No new lines on the face, no fever in the cheek. But beneath her skin, she itched with the knowledge that she was not quite the same as before. No one else seemed to notice at first. Mother clucked and fussed as usual. Vivienne rehearsed bon mots and witty allusions, as if nothing in the world existed outside of her social calendar. Even Penelope, shrewd as she was, seemed content to let Lila retreat into daydream. But on the fourth morning, Vivienne set her teacup down with a force that would have cracked lesser china and announced, "You are moping." Lila looked up from her untasted toast. "I am not." "You are," said Vivienne, eyes narrowed with the predatory precision of a barrister. "You stare out windows. You sigh. You decline to attend Lady Bertram's literary circle, even though Lord Harrington's nephew was in attendance. And it is common knowledge that he is to inherit both the estate and the gout." Mother, ever the referee, sniffed. "Lila is not herself this week." "On the contrary," Vivienne said, arch. "She is herself, just not the self we are used to." Lila set down her knife and fork, both hands trembling a little. She wished she could confess. "I am haunted by a waltz, a mask, and a secret that has teeth." Instead, she managed, "Perhaps I am simply tired." Vivienne's gaze was relentless. "You are hiding something." Mother smoothed her skirt. If she is, it can only be a disappointment to me. She shifted her focus to Vivienne. Your gown for Lady Agatha's ball is ready, by the way. I have arranged with Madame Lefebvre for a final fitting tomorrow. Lila, you may accompany your sister, if you are feeling robust. Lila nodded, grateful for the distraction. Vivienne let the matter drop, but only in the manner of a cat withdrawing from a mouse hole. She would wait, patiently, for a better angle. The house was a flurry of preparations for the Rose Ballroom's spring fete. The event was hosted, as every year, by the venerable Lady Agatha, a woman of such legendary social canniness that she could orchestrate a marriage proposal between mortal enemies and make it seem a spontaneous act of romance. Rumour said the guest list would be the crowning achievement of the season, a veritable parade of eligible men and ferocious mothers. Lila wondered, with a shiver, whether the Duke of Ravenshire would attend. She told herself it would not matter either way. The morning of the event, Penelope entered Lila's bedroom at dawn. She carried a tray of tea and, tucked discreetly behind it, a folded letter sealed in black wax. "A missive for you?" she said, eyes bright. Lila reached for the letter, but Penelope held it just out of reach. "You are not to swoon or drop your teacup. If you do, I shall never forgive you." Lila rolled her eyes, but promised to maintain composure. The letter, when she broke the seal, contained only 5 words in a bold, looping hand. "I will be there." Lila's heart leapt against her ribs. Penelope, watching closely, nodded as if this confirmed a private theory. "You will need a new ribbon," she said, "and perhaps a steadier hand for your gloves." Lila pressed the note to her chest. "What if—" She stopped, unsure how to shape the thought. "What if he recognizes me, without the mask?" Penelope set the tray down and perched on the edge of the bed, her confidence as reassuring as a warm blanket. "If he is as clever as you say, he will. And if he does not, well, perhaps you are not so memorable after all." "Thank you, Penelope. You have a singular talent for comfort." Penelope grinned. "I have a singular talent for reality, and also for removing grass stains if you intend to faint in a garden." They laughed together, and it was easier for a moment to imagine that tonight could be survived. The afternoon blurred into a frenzy of pinning, lacing, and the ceremonial torture of hair into submission. Vivienne was in rare form, delighted to be the centerpiece of such a celebrated assembly. She spent the hour before departure, posing in front of every mirror in the house, adjusting the angle of her ringlets to catch the last of the sun. Lila wore a pale green dress with tiny embroidered violets, her mother's choice, and one that promised not to draw a single superfluous glance. This, Lila thought, was for the best. She wanted to be overlooked. She wanted, equally, to be seen. Penelope, uncharacteristically sentimental, slipped a small, flat box into Lila's reticule before they left. "A token," she said, "for luck." Lila opened it to find a ribbon of deep blue, the exact colour of midnight. She thought of the masquerade, the way she had felt invincible, and tied it around her wrist beneath the cuff of her glove. "Thank you," she whispered. Penelope's eyes glimmered with pride. The journey to the Rose Ballroom was a study in familial tension. Mother instructed the coachman in the proper speed and trajectory, as if the difference between arriving first or third could alter the course of the family's fortune. Vivienne rehearsed greetings and topics of conversation under her breath, offering Lila unsolicited advice. "Don't blink so often. It makes you look nervous. Don't smile at Lord Darlington. His mother is watching for the slightest encouragement. Do stand a half step back when introduced. It is flattering to the taller gentleman. Lila tuned out the chatter, staring at the city's passing windows and doors. Her mind, as always, orbited the possibility of the Duke. Would he seek her out? Would he glance at her and see nothing more than a quiet, forgettable girl? She thought of his words on the terrace, the tenderness of his almost touch. She tried to recall how she had felt as the Nightingale, daring, sure, a creature of possibility. In the light of day, it was more difficult to muster that courage. She wondered what he would see. The Rose Ballroom was a palace of spectacle. Every guest was a jewel set in a velvet box, every movement choreographed for the greatest effect. The chandeliers burned with 1,000 candles, spilling gold onto the marble floor. The footmen glided through the crowd with trays of champagne, while musicians tuned their instruments at the far end of the room. Lila hovered at the edge, feeling both conspicuous and invisible as the noise and colour swelled around her. Within moments, Vivian was absorbed into a cluster of admirers, laughing with calculated abandon at the remarks of a viscount and a young colonel in dress uniform. Mother disappeared into the ranks of scheming matrons, leaving Lila momentarily, blessedly alone. She wandered to the refreshment table and selected a glass of lemonade, her hands still trembling. She scanned the room, searching for any sign of a black domino mask, before remembering with a pang that tonight there would be no masks. He would be himself. She almost missed him at first. The Duke of Ravenshire stood at the far edge of the room, perfectly composed, listening with polite disinterest to Lady Agatha's recitation of her grandson's latest triumphs at Eton. His eyes swept the crowd with military regularity, but betrayed no hint of recognition when they landed on her. Lila looked away quickly, her heart thudding with embarrassment and, she admitted it, disappointment. "Is it everything you dreamed?" Penelope's voice appeared, soft and close. Lila shook her head. "It is worse." Penelope, ever the strategist, leaned in. "You must meet his gaze, or he will never come to you. Men are like deer. They require the impression of a challenge before they will approach." Lila suppressed a laugh. "You are terrifying." "I am effective. Now go." Lila took a steadying breath and, with as much dignity as she could muster, made her way across the ballroom. Halfway there, she was intercepted by a pair of matrons who cooed and pinched her cheek and reminded her in no uncertain terms that she had grown up so well and would make a lovely wife once she found the right incentive. Lila endured the barrage, casting glances over their shoulders to see if the Duke was still present. He was, and this time, when their eyes met, he hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief it might have been imagined. But Lila felt the zing of it all the way to her toes. He excused himself from Lady Agatha, who appeared briefly affronted, and crossed the marble with a stride both determined and wholly at odds with the lazy grace he had projected at the Masquerade. He stopped a polite distance from her, bowing just enough to comply with etiquette. "Miss Fairchild?" he said, his voice low. Lila curtsied, heart fluttering. "Your Grace." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence gathered weight, pressing in from all sides. He was different without the mask, older, perhaps, and more vulnerable around the eyes. Lila felt herself blush, a bloom that crept up her neck and threatened to undermine any pretense of composure. "I believe we met briefly at Lady Ashcombe's garden breakfast," he said, tone measured. Lila nodded, uncertain if she ought to feign ignorance. "Briefly, yes." He looked at her, truly looked, as if searching for the blueprint of the nightingale beneath the surface. "It seems I am constantly re-encountering the same faces," he said, "and never quite knowing them as I ought." Lila smiled, grateful for the ambiguous safety of his words. "London is a city of illusions, Your Grace." He inclined his head. "Indeed. One might almost believe people are never quite what they seem." Lila felt the old thrill, the game, the secret, the careful fencing of words. She wondered if he would press her, but he did not. Instead, he offered her his arm. "Would you care to stroll? Lady Agatha's gardeners have outdone themselves. The roses are the pride of the city." Lila hesitated, glancing over her shoulder for Mother or Vivian. Both were occupied. "Yes," she said. "I should like that." He led her through the French doors and onto the terrace, where the air was softer and the noise of the ballroom faded to a velvet hush. They walked in silence for several paces, the only sound the gravel crunching beneath their shoes. "I was sorry to see you leave the masquerade so abruptly," he said, finally. Lila toyed with the blue ribbon at her wrist. "It seemed the prudent choice?" He smiled, a little sadly. "Prudence is a virtue I have never quite mastered." She looked up at him, emboldened by the dark. "Why do you attend such gatherings, if I may ask? The rumors say you detest society." He shrugged. "Perhaps I hoped for a glimpse of something authentic, or someone." He caught himself, the mask of composure slipping for a bare instant. Lila wondered if she should confess. Say, "I was there. I was the Nightingale. You danced with me. You nearly kissed me on the terrace." But the words tangled in her throat. He seemed to sense the conflict and let her off the hook. "My apologies," he said. "I did not mean to interrogate you." "You are not," she said, voice softer than she intended. "I just—" She stopped, uncertain. He turned to face her, the distance between them now measured in inches, not feet. "I have been looking for you," he said. "Or for someone who reminded me of you." Lila's breath caught. She wanted, desperately, to be that person. Before she could speak, the spell was broken by the sound of Vivian's laughter echoing through the garden. The Duke stepped back, composure restored. "We must return," he said. "Else the tongues will wag." Lila nodded, and together they walked back to the ballroom, their arms never quite touching. As they entered, Vivian caught Lila's eye and raised a brow. Triumph, suspicion, or simple curiosity, it was impossible to tell. Lila took her place at the edge of the dance floor and watched the Duke melt back into the crush of guests. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the wildness of her heart, and wondered if he could sense it, even from across the room. Penelope reappeared at her side, carrying a glass of punch and a look of immense satisfaction. "Well?" she asked. "He saw me," Lila whispered. "I think he really saw me." Penelope squeezed her hand. "Then everything is possible." Lila watched the Duke, resplendent and solitary, his eyes scanning the crowd for another glimpse of her. She felt the charge of it, a current that bound them, invisible but unbreakable. For the first time that evening, Lila smiled without reservation. Let the world wag its tongues. She was ready. The Rose Ballroom was designed for sensation, and on this night it excelled. From the instant the Fairchilds entered, Lila was battered by sound. The overlapping chatter of 100 tongues, the crystal-clear peal of laughter from the upper balconies, the murmur of scandal as it passed from group to group like a prayer. The air was thick with perfume and the heady promise of disaster. Everywhere, bodies pressed in, silk against velvet, feathered fans waging silent war for prominence, each attendee a brushstroke in a portrait of calculated excess. And yet, despite the ferocity of her surroundings, Lila's first instinct was to vanish. She clung to the wall at her mother's side, wishing herself as colourless and smooth as the marble beneath her feet. Vivian, by contrast, sailed into the room like a flagship, instantly claimed by a bevy of admirers, her voice rising above the din at regular strategic intervals. Lila, relegated to the margin, observed. It was not long before she spied the Duke. He was, as always, magnetic, flanked by his host, Lady Agatha, and a knot of gentlemen who orbited him as though he were the moon and they the lesser planets. Every few minutes, a different mother would parade a daughter past him, each girl executing a flawless curtsy before retreating in a cloud of hope and defeat. Through it all, the Duke appeared bored to the point of violence, his attention fixed not on the parade, but on the possibility of escape. Lila envied him that. She was about to slip toward the refreshment table, a destination blessed by obscurity, when a familiar voice accosted her. "Miss Fairchild, how ravishing you look." The speaker was Lady Agatha, resplendent in crimson and wielding a lorgnette with the authority of a general. She drew Lila close and whispered, "You must not allow your sister to monopolize the evening, dear. These men prefer a mystery." "I assure you, Lady Agatha, I am the least mysterious woman in the city." "Nonsense," the dowager declared. "I have heard it said that still waters run deepest, particularly in the matter of dukes." Lila flushed. "You have been misinformed." "I never am. But come, let us walk." Lady Agatha steered her through the crush, pausing only to deposit the latest gossip in every receptive ear. They passed a cluster of girls in feathered headbands, one of whom fixed Lila with a glare of such intensity that she nearly tripped on her own slippers. "Do not mind them," Lady Agatha murmured. "Their mothers have set their caps for the Duke as well. And you are the competition." Lila nearly choked. "I am no such thing." The dowager's eyes sparkled. "If you say so, my dear." They completed a circuit of the ballroom, pausing near the conservatory doors. Lady Agatha patted Lila's hand. "You are young yet, but mark my words. There are worse fates than being noticed by a man of consequence." Lila nodded, feeling every bit the naive child she must appear. After the dowager drifted away, Lila lingered near the doors, enjoying the illusion of solitude. She could see Vivienne across the room, executing a complicated maneuver that involved laughter, a well-placed sigh, and the calculated touch of an admirer's arm. Her mother, meanwhile, was deep in consultation with the Marquis of Davington's wife, a woman with the soul of a ferret and the patience of a crocodile. If anyone was looking for Lila, they had not found her. She watched the Duke, watched as he danced a set with the formidable Lady Agatha, watched as he drank a glass of something strong and then refused a second, watched as he submitted to 3 consecutive introductions before excusing himself with a bow so refined it bordered on parody. He did not look in her direction. It was a relief, in some ways, but also an agony. The first half of the evening passed in a blur of formalities. Lila endured the standard parade of partners, Lord Harrington's nephew, who talked of nothing but horses, a clergyman with hands like meat hooks, and an aspiring poet who recited 24 lines of blank verse about the moon before tripping over her foot and apologizing in Latin. She suffered it all with the stoicism of a martyr, conscious only of the fact that the Duke was not her partner. nor did he show any sign of wishing to be. Vivienne, by contrast, drew a succession of high-ranking suitors. She danced, she sparkled, she dominated every conversation. Once, Lila caught her sister watching the Duke with a look of calculation so pure it could have been distilled and sold at the apothecary. It was almost a mercy then, when the Duke appeared at Lila's side as she sipped lemonade and tried not to cry. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice low and so familiar it sent a shiver through her. She turned, carefully. He was still more beautiful than any man had a right to be, though there was a new tension around his mouth, as if he'd spent the entire night resisting the urge to shout. "Your Grace," she replied, grateful her voice did not betray her. "I see your sister has taken the evening by storm." Lila managed a smile. "Vivienne is—" She struggled for a word that was not formidable or relentless. "Vivienne is Vivienne." He inclined his head, a silent joke passing between them. They stood in silence for a moment, the world rushing by at a mad pace while they clung to the eye of the storm. "Do you enjoy these affairs?" he asked eventually. "Not especially," she admitted. "Nor do I." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Would you care for a walk?" Lila hesitated, aware of the eyes upon them, of the relentless gossip machine already grinding out rumors. But in the end, she nodded. They passed through the doors and into the garden, the air sharp and fragrant with the promise of spring. For several minutes, they walked without speaking, the silence between them not awkward, but companionable. At last, he stopped near a hedge of early blooming roses and turned to her. "You look different tonight." Lila tensed. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he said, "but it is unfamiliar. I had hoped to see a certain confidence. Instead, you seem—" He broke off, uncertain. "Terrified?" she supplied. He smiled. "Determined." Lila looked away. "Masks are easier than faces sometimes." He studied her, as though trying to fit the Nightingale to the girl before him. "May I ask you a question?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "What is it that you want?" Lila startled at the bluntness. She searched for the answer. "I think I want to matter, even if only for a night." He nodded, as if he had expected this. "You do?" Lila laughed, soft and broken. "You barely know me." "On the contrary, I know exactly what it is to want to be seen. And I have seen you." They stood very close now, the world narrowed to the breath between their lips. She wanted him to kiss her. He did not. Instead, he reached up and brushed a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers lingering just long enough for her to feel the tremor in them. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Fairchild." Lila wanted to tell him she already had. A sound from the terrace startled them apart, Vivienne's voice, bright and brittle. "Lila, there you are." She turned to see her sister, flanked by a retinue of curious onlookers, making her way down the steps with the determined grace of a hunting hound. "Forgive me," Lila said, stepping back. The Duke bowed, composure restored. "Of course." Vivienne reached her side in seconds, her eyes flickering between Lila and the Duke with barely concealed suspicion. "Mother requires you," she said, a little too loudly. "The Marquis of Davington wishes to make your acquaintance." Lila nodded, and with one last, longing look at the Duke, let herself be whisked back into the light and noise. The rest of the night was a blur. Lila danced, she smiled, she listened to stories about horses and gout and the relative merits of French versus English gloves. But her mind remained in the garden, with the Duke and the question he had asked her. What did she want? At midnight, as the guests began to thin and the first wave of carriages lined up outside, she found herself standing alone near the doors. The city beyond was alive with promise, but inside she felt the weight of every eye, every expectation. Penelope appeared at her elbow, carrying a shawl and a look of fierce pride. "Did you see him?" Lila asked, barely above a whisper. Penelope nodded. "He could not take his eyes from you." Lila smiled, a secret smile, and wrapped herself in the shawl. She was tired to the bone, but not defeated. For the first time in her life, she was certain of what she wanted, and she meant to have it, mask or no mask. Outside, on the steps, she paused to catch her breath. The city stretched away in all directions, limitless and wild. Somewhere behind her, the Duke of Ravensshire was watching. She could feel the heat of his gaze, the promise of unfinished stories. She turned, slowly, and met his eyes through the haze of candlelight and night. He smiled, just for her. She smiled back. It was enough, for now. Chapter 6. The midnight masquerade was a world apart. Every inch of the old Berkeley townhouse remade as a theatre of excess, devotion, and calculated danger. The candlelight was more than a glow. It was a challenge. It licked at gilded cornices and curled around the limbs of dancers, casting shifting halos and sharpening every shadow. A haze of perfume and anticipation hung in the air, as potent as the champagne being passed by men in domino masks and silver-trimmed livery. Here, the night was a currency, and everyone spent it recklessly. The Nightingale, no longer merely Lila, but not yet entirely the legend, stood at the top of the marble staircase, hand poised on the balustrade. Her mask was a blue so pure it might have been carved from the sky itself, stitched with feathers and edged in light-catching crystals. Her heart pounded so violently she worried the sound would draw attention before her entrance even began. But that was the plan, was it not? To be seen. Not as a pawn in Vivian's wake, or as an afterthought to her mother's schemes, but as the object of pure, undiluted spectacle. She allowed herself a single, steadying breath, then descended. The ballroom below was an ocean of faces, each hidden and yet, in the strangeness of the masquerade, more honest than ever. Some wore the masks of heroes, others of foxes or birds or midnight skulking cats. All were united in the pursuit of forbidden games. Lila's slippers whispered against the marble, each step sending ripples through the crowd. By the time she reached the floor, half a dozen eyes tracked her, but only one gaze held her fast, storm blue, clear as winter, and just as treacherous. He stood near the orchestra, impeccably severe in black, his mask a slash of darkness against the aristocratic angles of his cheekbones. Even across the room, the Duke of Ravensshire radiated intent. It was not the intent of a man hunting prey, but of a man who had already marked it as his own, and simply waited for the world to agree. She felt his focus before he even moved. When he did, parting the crowd as if it owed him a debt, it was with a slow, unhurried confidence. There were women trailing his orbit, each hoping to be the one who would draw his attention, but he did not so much as glance at them. He stopped a respectful distance from her, just long enough for the surrounding guests to notice and hush. "Nightingale," he said, bowing with a precision that somehow managed to mock the very idea of bowing. "You return to us more resplendent than ever." Your Grace, she replied, pulse quickening. I had not expected you to be quite so punctual. He smiled, and it was a dangerous thing. Some legends are worth the wait. Others I am determined to catch before they vanish. She managed a laugh, light and melodic, exactly the laugh the nightingale should possess. Is it catching me you hope for? Or unmasking me? He considered her. Both, I think. But I suspect you would make the game last as long as possible. The band had struck up a waltz, something fevered and French and entirely unsuitable for the English temperament. Couples spun, blurred by speed and champagne, but the Duke's hand at her elbow was steady as fate itself. May I? He asked, not as a supplicant, but as a partner in conspiracy. She let herself be led onto the dance floor, her nerves melting away into the comfort of practiced steps. He was an exceptional dancer, as everyone said, but it was more than the mechanics of movement. It was how he watched her, as if every gesture revealed a new secret. You seem entirely at home here, he said as they turned, her skirts flaring like a banner. I have had practice, she replied, and it was nearly true. He leaned in, close enough that only she would hear. They say you are the daughter of a Russian princess, or the mistress of a Venetian count. She arched a brow. Which do you prefer? Neither, he said, his tone bare of the expected flirtation. I prefer the truth. And what would you do with it, if you had it? He tightened his hand on her waist, barely perceptible, but enough to send her thoughts spiraling. Cherish it, perhaps. Or at the very least, protect it from those who would use it to wound. She could not help the shiver that ran through her. You speak as if you have known wounds. A muscle in his jaw flexed. And you speak as if you have none. The room whirled, lights and faces smeared into colour, but the world narrowed to the heat of his hand and the piercing intelligence of his gaze. He broke the tension with a soft, almost reluctant laugh. You are very good at this, he murmured. At what? She asked, genuinely unsure. At becoming whoever they need you to be. I suppose that is the essence of a masquerade. Is it not what we are all doing? She asked, her voice almost lost to the music. Even when unmasked. He nodded, thoughtful. Perhaps you are right. But I suspect your mask is less a disguise than a liberation. You make it sound so noble, she teased, because the alternative was to collapse into a puddle of self-consciousness. He smiled again, but this time there was something vulnerable behind it, as if he wanted to tell her a secret but could not yet find the words. They completed the circuit of the room, drawing more attention with each pass. Lila could feel the eyes, hear the speculative whispers, but for once she relished it. The nightingale was not an object of derision or pity. She was a subject of fascination. As the dance drew to a close, the Duke did not release her hand. Instead, he led her to the periphery, where the music and conversation faded into a velvet hush. Will you allow me to ask you something impertinent? He said, thumb brushing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Only if you promise not to take offense if I refuse to answer. He inclined his head. Deal. Very well, ask. He hesitated, and she sensed it was not for effect, but because the question mattered. Why do you do it? He said, quietly. Why risk being unmasked? Why not remain safe, invisible? She considered. I suppose because I have been invisible all my life. It is a strange thing to know you exist only as a shadow behind someone else's spotlight. The masquerade. It is the only place I can be seen, even if they are only seeing the mask. He searched her face, his own expression softening. They are seeing more than you think, he said. But He broke off, then started again. I see you. She stared at him, heat rushing up her neck. Then you know too much already, Your Grace. Not enough, he said, and it was a confession more than a challenge. They stood, suspended in a space between music and meaning, neither willing to break the spell. Finally, he said, Will you grant me another dance? She should have refused. She knew it, felt it in the warning bells clanging behind her ribs, but the desire to remain in his orbit overpowered every sensible thought. Only if you can keep up, Your Grace, she said. His laugh was low and genuine. I intend to do more than keep up. He swept her back onto the floor, and this time their movements were less formal, more a conversation than a contest. Each touch, each glance was layered with the history they had built in such a short span of time, the first encounter, the mutual recognition, the unspoken longing. At the end of the set, she was breathless, dizzy not from the dance, but from the possibility that this, whatever it was, could mean everything. The world came back into focus. Guests, emboldened by the Nightingale's bravura, now danced with less restraint. Masks were askew, laughter was ribald. But Lila and the Duke existed in a pocket of their own making. He bent his head, and for a mad moment she thought he might kiss her, right there, amid the scandalized matrons and delighted gossips. Instead, he whispered, There is a place, a balcony, just above the second landing. Would you— She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He offered his arm, and together they disappeared from the dance floor, watched by 100 pairs of eyes, none of which could have imagined the truth of what passed between them. The masquerade spun on, unheeding, but for the Nightingale and the Duke, the world had narrowed to the promise of what might be said in the quiet, candlelit dark. The balcony was not truly a balcony, but rather a broad stone ledge hidden behind a tangle of velvet drapery and a barricade of potted bay trees. The candles were fewer here, the air sharp with the mingled scents of London night and the ghost of lavender from the garden below. Outside, the city was a mosaic of flickering lamps, a kingdom of secrets. The hush was so absolute that Lila felt as though she and the Duke had stepped out of the current of time and into a private, parallel hour that belonged to them alone. She stood at the edge, her back to him, hands gripping the cold rail. She needed a moment to steady her breathing. She could not let him see how the prospect of solitude with him both thrilled and terrified her. But he was already behind her, close enough that she felt his presence before he spoke. Thank you, he said, voice softened by the hush and something more. For what? She managed, not trusting herself to look at him. For making this night real, he replied. I have attended 1,000 balls, worn 100 masks, and never once wished the evening would last forever. Until now. The words hit her with the force of confession, and she risked a glance over her shoulder. His mask, black, simple, severe, had slipped a little, revealing the vulnerable set of his mouth, the faintest line of fatigue at the edge of his eyes. She turned, pressing her back to the stone, and matched his gaze. You make it sound as though I cast a spell. He smiled, tired and true. Perhaps you have. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the silence stretching, but not straining. Lila's hands itched to reach for him, but she kept them knotted at her waist. You said you wanted to unmask me, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Is that still true? His answer was immediate. Yes, but not tonight. She blinked, thrown. Why not? Because I find I would rather be given the truth than take it. He reached up, and for one held breath, she thought he meant to untie the ribbon after all. But his fingers only grazed the edge of the mask, tracing the curve of it, as though memorizing something he was not yet permitted to keep. Whoever you are beneath this, I want her to hand herself to me, not have her stolen off in the dark by a man too impatient to wait for morning. She felt herself flush, the heat of it prickling along her collarbone. No one had ever spoken to her this way, not as a curiosity, not as a duty, but as a revelation. That is either the most honourable thing anyone has ever said to me, she managed, or the most maddening. I have been told it is frequently both. He let his hand fall, though it cost him something to do it. She could see the cost in the set of his jaw. He leaned on the rail beside her, and together they watched the city pulse below. After a while he said, I never wanted the title, you know. I wanted to teach, to travel. But the world is indifferent to what we want. She found her voice. It is easier, perhaps, to wear the mask, even if it chafes. He glanced at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Is that why you do it? Because the truth is too dangerous? She hesitated, then nodded. The truth is, I am ordinary. I am invisible, and I always will be, except for tonight, when I can pretend otherwise. He reached for her hand, enveloping it in his own. You are not invisible to me. Nightingale or not, I see you. I have from the first moment you looked at me over that fool's shoulder and did not look away. The words landed somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed there. He released her hand, only to touch her cheek, slow, reverent, as if she were a miracle, careful to skirt the edge of the mask rather than disturb it. You have no idea what you do to me, he murmured. She dared a joke. Is it the blue feathers? He laughed, the sound low and raw. It is everything. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face, then said, There is a thing I wish to do. I have never asked permission before, but with you... He trailed off, waiting. Her heart thundered. What is it? He cupped her cheek with his palm, thumb trembling against her skin. I would like to kiss you, but only if you want me to. She could not speak. She could only nod. He bent, and the world fell away. His mouth was hesitant, the first brush of his lips more a question than an answer. But when she leaned into him, he deepened the kiss, the hand at her cheek sliding to the nape of her neck. She wrapped her arms around him, fingers fisting in his coat. His other arm circled her waist, anchoring her to him as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. The kiss was not what she had expected, neither frantic nor showy, but patient, exploratory, hungry in a way that made her whole body ache. He kissed her as if he were learning her, as if every movement mattered, as if the space between them was the only place he could ever exist. She felt the press of his body, the rise and fall of his chest, the taste of champagne and longing. The world beyond the stone ledge might as well have ceased to exist. When at last he broke away, he rested his forehead against hers. His breathing was uneven, so was hers. I have wanted to do that since the first time I saw you, he said, voice rough. She laughed, breathless, giddy. At the masquerade, or at Lady Ashcombe's breakfast? Both, he admitted. And every moment since? They stood there, wrapped in each other, the city spreading infinite below. Lila felt as if she had finally stepped into her own skin, as if the world were suddenly vast and possible. But then the truth crashed in. She was herself, and he was a duke, and there were centuries of law and custom lined up between them. She stepped back, breaking contact, the loss of his warmth immediate and cruel. "I should go," she said, hating herself for saying it. He caught her hand, desperate. "Stay." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "If I stay, I will never leave. And then where will we be?" He stared at her, pain written clear across his face. "Is it so terrible, the idea of being with me?" She squeezed his hand. "No, that is the problem. I want it too much." He pulled her into one last embrace, hard and urgent. She let herself melt into him, memorizing the way he held her, the way her body fit against his. When he released her, she slipped away, her mask still in place, the ribbon he had not untied trailing loose against her throat. She made her way down the hidden staircase, pausing only once to look back. He was still there, silhouetted against the candlelight, watching her as if the act of looking could will her back to his side. She descended into the ballroom, but the noise and colour felt faded now. She had left something vital behind on that balcony, and she doubted she would ever get it back. When she finally found Penelope, waiting by the exit with the patience of a saint and the alertness of a hawk, her maid took one look at her and said, "Well?" Lila tried for a smile. "I think I may be ruined." Penelope's eyes softened. Was it worth it? Lila touched her lips, still tingling. Yes. Penelope wrapped a shawl around her, and together they slipped out into the waiting night, the masquerade still raging behind them. Above, the Duke of Ravenshire stood at the rail until the candles guttered and the city grew silent. He pressed his fingers to his lips, as if to hold the taste of her there a little longer. He did not know how he would find her again, or if he could. All he knew was that the world, once so carefully mapped, was now a land of shadows and blue-winged miracles. He turned back to the ballroom, but already he was planning. 100 schemes, 1,000 strategies, all of them in service to the single impossible dream of having her at his side. He would move heaven and earth. He would become legend if that was what it took. But for tonight, he stood beneath the cold stars, burning, and whispered the only name he had to give her to the dark, Nightingale. Chapter 7. Lila Fairchild awoke the next morning to the world as it had always been, except that it was not. The sun filtered through her bedroom curtains, dusty and golden as ever, but her heart, oh, her traitor heart, raced so fiercely she feared it might leap clear from her chest and make an exhibition of itself over the marmalade at breakfast. She lay very still for a moment, recalling the night in fragments, the balcony, the Duke's mouth on hers, his hand gentle at her cheek and unyielding at her waist. Every recollection made her toes curl and her breath catch in a most unseemly fashion. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, as if to prevent the wildness from spilling over into the sensible morning. But the world did not allow for such luxuries. Her mother's voice carried up the stairwell, brisk and bright as always. "Lila! Breakfast in 10 minutes, and do not come down with ink-stained fingers, please. It is only the second day of the week. Let us not look as though defeated already." Penelope entered on cue, bearing a tray and the ever-watchful gaze of one who saw more than she let on. "Did you sleep?" Penelope inquired, setting the tray down. "You look as though you have spent the night wrestling with angels." "Is it so obvious?" Lila said, rolling over to let the pillow muffle her embarrassment. Penelope drew back the curtains with a clatter. Obvious to me, yes. To the rest of the world, you remain an enigma. Lila attempted a laugh, but it emerged wobbly. If only I could bottle my confusion and sell it at Gunter's, I would be richer than Vivian's suitors. Penelope considered her a moment. The adventure has not ended then. Last night was not a dream. Lila's face burned at the memory. She had kissed the Duke of Ravenshire. No, he had kissed her. She had wanted it. No, she had wanted it so much that she feared the memory would become its own living, breathing scandal, visible to every eye in Mayfair. Penelope did not chide her, but merely set out the day's dress and regarded Lila with the patience of a cat observing a trembling mouse. You will have to face the world sometime, Miss Lila. Let me have 5 more minutes of cowardice, Lila pleaded. 2, and not a second more. If your mother is left alone with the porridge, there will be consequences for us all. Lila made herself rise. She let Penelope lace her up, tighter than usual, as if containment could be achieved by force of corsetry alone. She allowed her hair to be arranged, her slippers buckled, and her petticoat fluffed, all while her mind replayed the balcony scene in ever-increasing detail until she nearly swooned from her own treacherous memory. Breakfast was the usual battleground. Her mother in command, Vivienne at her most luminous, and father buried in the London papers as though the city's fortunes depended on his steady digestion. Vivienne looked up from her egg, eyes narrowed. You are late, Lila. Only a little. A minute late is a year in this household, her mother said. Sit, darling, and pour for yourself. Lila obeyed, folding her hands to hide their trembling. Vivienne studied her. Did you not sleep? Lila selected her words with care. I slept, but I dreamt. Perhaps that amounts to the same thing. Vivienne pursed her lips, then shrugged. At least you have dreams. All I get are Lady Ashcombe's invitations and dire warnings about what will happen if I do not sit for my next portrait. Their mother smiled with the tolerant air of one who had suffered 2 daughters and was determined not to let it break her. Vivienne, you exaggerate. No one expects you to sit for a portrait unless you are proposed to before Thursday. And the invitations are from the same 6 houses every week, Vivienne interjected, with the weary martyrdom of a general reviewing the trenches. Lila drank her tea and focused on the safe, repetitive motions. Sip, place, repeat. But her mind rebelled, wandering again to the Duke's lips on hers, the warmth of his hand. The knowledge that he had wanted her, not as a mask, not as a witticism or a reputation, but as herself, or as the self she became in the Nightingale's feathers. Lila, you are staring into the void, Vivienne observed, a note of concern peeking through her usual indifference. What are you thinking about? Poetry, Lila said, too quickly. Vivienne laughed. God save us. Poetry at breakfast. Better than politics, father intoned without looking up. Their mother frowned. Lila, I hope you have not let all that scribbling of verse distract you from the matter at hand. Lady Agatha's tea is this Thursday. It is imperative that you do not do anything. Here her voice softened. Unpredictable. I shall endeavour to be as dull as possible, Lila promised. Mother looked gratified. Vivienne looked unconvinced. The day passed in a haze of chores and lessons, none of which penetrated Lila's distraction. Even her beloved French tutor, who delighted in assigning her the most scandalous passages from Voltaire, could not extract her full attention. She found herself doodling on her blotter. Lines, then feathers, then the vague outline of a black mask, until she realized Penelope was watching, arms folded. "You cannot live in the memory forever," Penelope whispered, when they were alone in the upstairs corridor. "I know." Penelope straightened Lila's collar with a quick, affectionate tug. "If the Duke is as smitten as you say, he will find you, but you must give him something to find." Lila, suddenly shy, asked, "What if he recognizes me in the light of day?" "Then you must decide if you want him to." Penelope's eyes were kind, but unyielding. Lila nodded, and for the first time in years, she wondered if it was possible for someone to know both halves of her, the wallflower and the Nightingale, and not be repulsed by the contradiction. At the very same hour, across Mayfair, the Duke of Ravenshire was engaged in his own, considerably less romantic, crisis. He was pacing his library, the fire burning low, the air thick with the scent of ink, old vellum, and an unfamiliar, bitter anticipation. He had kissed her, the Nightingale. And in the moment, it had seemed not only inevitable, but necessary. He had kissed many women before, duchesses, courtesans, the odd ambassador's daughter, but never one who haunted him after the fact. He had thought a kiss would settle the matter, would satisfy whatever restless thing in him had been chasing her since the first masquerade. It had not. Instead, her vulnerability, the trembling in her voice, had hollowed him out and filled him with a curious ache. He could not stop replaying the moment, her mouth yielding beneath his, the delicate quiver of her hands, the flash of fear and longing in her eyes. He needed to see her again, not as the Nightingale, but as herself. But who was she? He turned, sharply, as a knock sounded at the door. Julian, his perennial shadow and the only friend whose company he tolerated before noon, entered with the effrontery of one who had never known his place and never intended to learn it. "Ravenshire, you look wretched," Julian announced, flopping into a chair. "Thank you for your concern," the Duke replied, pacing harder. "What is it now? Has Lady Ashcombe accused you of cheating at cards, or has White's begun wagering on your marriage prospects again?" "Neither," Ravenshire snapped. "It is—" He hesitated, unwilling to betray the depth of his agitation. Julian studied him, shrewd as ever. "It's a woman." The Duke exhaled, hating that it was so obvious. "Not a woman. The woman. The Nightingale." Julian brightened. "Ah, the legend. It said she danced every set at the masquerade, and that you danced every one of them with her." "Rumours exaggerate. I danced 2 sets." Julian grinned. "You might as well have proposed." Ravenshire glared. "She is unlike anyone I have ever known, but I cannot find her outside the masquerade. She vanishes, disappears. It is as if she is not real." The Duke shook his head. "Too real. Terrifyingly so." Julian steepled his fingers, the way he did when preparing to destroy someone's argument. "Have you considered that the answer is right before you? Sometimes the greatest secrets are those hidden in plain sight." Ravenshire frowned. "I have considered every debutante in London, and none fit the profile. She is quick, but not rehearsed, poised, but not schooled for it. She speaks French like a Parisian, but refuses to show off. She—" He cut himself off, embarrassed by his own fervour. "Have you seen her since?" Julian asked. "At the Rose Ballroom, perhaps. There was a girl, unremarkable at first glance, but I cannot be certain. Julian looked pleased. Then your task is simple. Attend more balls. Find the girl who reminds you of the Nightingale and see if she sings. The Duke snorted. You make it sound as easy as buying a new hat. It's not so different, if you know your milliners. Julian sobered. But beware, Ravenshire. If you find her, you may discover she is not what you wish her to be. Ravenshire looked at the fire. I hope for once to be disappointed. Julian laughed and let himself out. The next week passed in a blur of social events, every one of them more tedious than the last. Lila attended them all. Teas, luncheons, carriage rides in the park, a musicale at the home of an earl's widow who believed all music should be played at the volume of cannon fire. She kept to the periphery, as ever, but now her gaze drifted to the door at every event, searching for a flash of blue eyes, a hint of severe black coat. When she saw the Duke, it was always at a distance, never alone, always beset by admirers, each of whom seemed determined to devour him whole. She caught him watching her once at Lady Harrington's tea. Their eyes met over a sea of pink-iced cakes, and the force of the connection made her hand tremble so violently she nearly dropped her cup. He looked away at once, but she knew he had seen her. Vivienne was watching too. You do not like tea, Vivienne observed, when they were safely in their carriage afterwards. I do not like much of anything lately, Lila replied, before she could stop herself. Vivienne raised a brow, but did not press. Lady Harrington's nephew is sweet on you, she offered instead. Sweetness is not an argument for matrimony, Lila said. Vivienne smiled, sly. Then what is? Lila stared out the window at the passing shops, the hum of the city. Perhaps I want to be known for something other than my utility. Vivienne laughed, but there was an edge to it. Be careful, Lila. In this family, ambition is a luxury. Lila nodded and said nothing more. 3 days later, Lila and her family attended a breakfast at Lady Agatha's, an event renowned for its mercilessly early hour and its even more merciless conversation. Lila found herself at a table surrounded by matrons in various stages of social anxiety, all discussing the upcoming season and the various methods by which their daughters might be catapulted to glory. At the far end of the room, the Duke of Ravensshire stood in elegant misery, cornered by a phalanx of ambitious mammas and their cowering offspring. He looked up once, found Lila's gaze, and held it for a beat longer than custom allowed. Lila felt the colour rise in her cheeks, and quickly turned her attention to her plate. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. She was barely conscious of the conversation, only that the world had grown too bright, too loud, and the only thing that felt real was the pressure of the Duke's gaze, following her across the room. Later, as she stood with Vivienne in the garden, ostensibly admiring the tulips, she caught the Duke's reflection in the glass doors behind them. Vivienne's tone was casual. You've caught his eye, you know. Who? Lila said, willing herself to sound innocent. Vivienne scoffed. The Duke. He has not stopped watching you. Lila could not think of a suitable reply. Vivienne's voice softened. What is going on, Lila? You are not yourself. Maybe I am more myself than ever, Lila whispered. Vivienne stared, startled. If you are plotting to become a scandal, I must insist on advance notice. It is only fair. Lila smiled, her first real smile in days. If I become a scandal, you will be the second to know. Vivienne looked at her, long and hard, and then, unexpectedly, laughed. It would be something, wouldn't it? To be known for something other than standing in the background? Yes, Lila agreed, surprising herself with the fierceness of her answer. It would. That night, Lila lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart thundering. She thought of the Duke, of the mask, of the truth she carried like a live coal in her chest. She wondered what it would be like to be seen, truly seen. Not as the Nightingale, not as an ornament to her family's ambitions, but as herself. She wondered if he would still want her when the truth came out. She was terrified to find out, but she was more terrified not to. She drifted to sleep, dreaming of blue masks and stolen kisses and the possibility that somewhere in the world a man was thinking of her as she truly was. Somewhere in the heart of London, the Duke of Ravensshire stared into his fire and resolved to find her, no matter the cost. Lady Agatha's afternoon tea was a masterclass in controlled chaos, equal parts battlefield and theatre, and the assembled guests approached the engagement with the grim determination of Waterloo veterans. The garden was a delirium of colour, parasols, bonnets, and the impossible optimism of spring flowers. Lila, trailing behind her mother and Vivienne, could not help but think the entire event designed to expose the weaknesses of its prey. They arrived late by 5 minutes and were made to suffer for it. The assembled mothers, carnivorous and florid, watched their approach with the air of generals reviewing fresh recruits. Lady Agatha herself greeted them at the threshold, a dowager duchess in purple taffeta and a lacy cap that could have doubled as a naval signal flag. She seized both Lila's hands in her own, then examined her as if appraising a new breed of canary. "My dear, you are grown," she exclaimed, though she had seen Lila only a week ago. "And Vivienne, you are a vision. Lady Fairchild, you must be so proud of your beautiful daughters." Mother demurred with a smile that, Lila knew, masked her desperate hope that the Duke of Ravensshire would be in attendance. Lila scanned the party, nerves taut as a violin string, and found him at once. He stood near a marble fountain, surrounded by the highest concentration of debutantes in London. He did not seem to notice any of them. His gaze, as if drawn by invisible thread, snapped to Lila the moment she entered the garden. There was no smile, no nod, not even a flicker of recognition, but she felt the full weight of his attention like a hand pressed to the small of her back. Lila did not look away. She could not. She felt the tingle of the Nightingale's mask at her temple, even though her face was bare. It was an intimacy both terrifying and exhilarating, as if every secret she had ever nursed had become visible on her skin. Vivienne, in a lilac gown that set off her eyes to riotous advantage, looped her arm through Lila's and hissed, "Don't gawk." "I am not gawking," Lila lied. "You are. And so is he," Vivienne said, satisfaction curling the edge of her mouth. "He must be here to see me." Lila, momentarily overcome by an urge to confess everything, bit her tongue. They moved into the crowd. Lady Agatha herded them toward the refreshment table, where a footman poured sherry with the precision of a surgeon. Conversation rose and fell in tactical waves. The new governess at Davington House, the scandalous neckline of Miss Bartlett's dress, the rumour that a certain Viscount had been seen playing cards with actresses in Covent Garden. Lila focused on the sherry, hoping the sweet burn might steel her nerves. Instead, it made her fingertips go numb. Penelope, present in her capacity as lady's maid, but never far from the centre of information, appeared at her side. "You are to be called upon," she whispered, then vanished with the efficiency of a stagehand pulling scenery. The call came sooner than Lila expected. "Miss Fairchild," said the Duke's voice behind her. "Might I prevail upon you for a moment's conversation?" It was not a question. It was an inevitability. Lila turned, and the sunlight caught the blue of his eyes, turning them as pale and hard as frost. He bowed, formal and perfect. She curtsied, inwardly cursing the tremor in her knees. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, steady as she could manage. He led her a few paces away, to a shaded bower lined with baskets of violets and the low hum of bees. The air was heavy with the perfume of them, cloying, intoxicating. "You are fond of poetry," the Duke said, without preamble. Lila felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I am, Your Grace." His lips quirked. "Do you have a favourite line?" She hesitated, wary. "Only the ones I remember." He regarded her, the silence stretching between them, then said, "Do you recall the passage? All night a bird, all night a nightingale, sings the song of longing in the shadowed wood?" It was an obscure line from a poem only ever read aloud in the fevered privacy of her own chambers. Lila's heart stopped and then thudded, so loud she thought he must hear it. She let the moment hang, then countered, "I find it overwrought, Your Grace." He looked at her with that same directness she remembered from the Masquerade. "Perhaps, but I have often wondered who taught the bird to sing." It was the very challenge she had posed months ago in a letter to the editor of the London Review, signed only with the initials L.F. She had been foolish then to think such things left no trace. Lila drew herself up. Perhaps it sings because it cannot help itself. Perhaps the world would be less if it did not. He smiled, slow and devastating. Or perhaps it sings to be heard. She stared at him, unable to breathe. "Does Your Grace believe the world listens?" He leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Some do." She thought he might say more, might unmask her, here and now. But at that moment, Vivienne arrived in a flutter of skirts and well-aimed curiosity. "Lila!" she sang out. "You are not monopolizing the Duke, I hope." Lila stepped back at once, and the Duke retreated with military precision. "Not at all," Lila said, forcing a smile. His Grace was only explaining the finer points of natural history. Vivienne giggled. "How utterly dull. I prefer a less scholarly conversation myself." The Duke did not smile, but his eyes flickered with something like amusement. "I leave you in your sister's capable hands, Miss Fairchild." He bowed to both of them, then melted back into the crowd. Vivienne turned at once, pinning Lila with her most inquisitorial glare. "You were blushing." "I was not." "You were, and so was he." Lila summoned all the poise she could. "Vivienne, I beg you, do not start another campaign." Vivienne relented, but only slightly. "At least try to look less tragic. You have the air of a girl in a painting. Is that the effect you are going for?" Lila, remembering the Duke's words, said, "I suppose I have no choice. Perhaps I am only learning to sing." Vivienne looked at her, puzzled, but the moment was lost as a cluster of girls surrounded them, clamouring for news and the chance to be seen at the Duke's elbow. For the rest of the afternoon, Lila maintained her station at Vivienne's side, playing her role with just enough precision to keep the world at bay. But inside, she was in disarray. The Duke had recognized her. He must have. She had not been clever enough, or fast enough, or daring enough to deny it. He knew the truth, or enough of it to make her entire charade seem as flimsy as tissue paper. She watched him across the garden as he worked through the crowd with deliberate, unhurried grace. He made conversation with old ladies, smiled at children, accepted compliments and offers with the easy authority of a man born to be the object of every room. But every few minutes, his gaze drifted back to her, and the world stilled. When the party began to thin and the carriages lined up at the drive, Lila felt her heart sink with the sense of a story ending before its final chapter. She gathered her gloves and reticule, pausing at the edge of the garden. The Duke was already there, as if waiting for her. "Miss Fairchild?" he said, bowing once more. She stopped. "Your Grace." He seemed to wrestle with something, then said, "If ever you require a friend, or an escape, you have only to send word." She almost laughed. "I am not sure London allows for either." He regarded her with unguarded honesty. "Perhaps not. But there are places, balconies, hidden behind velvet curtains, where one might, if only for a moment, be unobserved." She felt herself flush, remembering the press of his mouth to hers, the hunger of that kiss. "I fear I am not so brave," she said. He shook his head. "You are the bravest person I have met." She looked at him, and for the first time let herself believe it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She rejoined her family, Vivian chattering about the dullness of Lady Agatha's son and the appalling lack of eligible bachelors this year. Lila let the chatter wash over her, but her thoughts were far away. She had been found out. She had been seen. And it was not the end of the world. In fact, it felt as though something had only just begun. The Duke watched the Fairchilds depart, Lila's profile sharp against the carriage window. He felt the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but also the desperation of a man who realizes he has only started to understand the picture. Julian, who had appeared at his elbow with the impeccable timing of a Greek chorus, said, "You have that look again, the one that says, 'I am about to ruin my life and enjoy every minute of it.'" Ravenshire allowed himself a faint smile. "You were right. The secret was in plain sight." Julian shook his head. "You realize what you are doing?" "Not yet. But I intend to find out." They strolled through the emptying garden, and the Duke found himself, for the first time in memory, looking forward to the next day. He would see her again, and this time he would not let her go without a fight. Chapter 8. It was the height of the season, and all of London, at least the 2 square miles that mattered, had become a theatre of whisper and speculation. The fairer half of Mayfair obsessed over a single subject, and it was not the king's gout or the price of Spanish lace. It was her, the Nightingale, the enigma who sang at every midnight ball, danced with dukes, and disappeared before the first carriages were called. In drawing rooms and clubhouses, her legend grew like a mushroom after rain. "She is the daughter of an exiled French marquis," declared Lady Bertram, who believed all scandal originated in France. "Nonsense," countered the Countess of Uxbridge. "She's an actress, hired by Lady Ashcombe for mischief." Whites ran odds daily on her true identity, the latest favourites being a Prussian princess, a famed courtesan in disguise, or, the outside bet, some ordinary debutante who'd mastered the art of illusion. It would have been delightful had Lila Fairchild not known the answer. She could not escape it. The talk followed her everywhere, even into the polite haven of Lady Ashcombe's Thursday tea, where she took a seat by the French doors and tried to concentrate on her embroidery. The murmur of conversation, punctuated by shrieks of laughter from the terrace, seemed to encircle her like hounds on a fox. She kept her head down, needle trembling, until the world narrowed to the hummingbird flicker of thread through linen. Even this was no refuge. "Miss Fairchild?" A masculine voice, low and precise, startled her so severely she pricked her finger. She looked up, and there was Sir Cedric Harrow. He wore his brown hair swept back with a mathematical exactness, his smile engineered to seem bashful and earnest, though a clever observer might note the calculation in it. She pressed her handkerchief to her finger and attempted a smile. "Sir Cedric, how lovely to see you." "And you, Miss Fairchild?" He hovered above her chair with the deference of a man trained never to sit unless invited. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment's company. I have been asked to assemble a party for the botanical exhibition and wish to secure your opinion on the finer points of lilies." The request, on the surface, was so innocent that Lila's heart slowed its frantic tattoo. "Yes, of course," she replied, rising. He offered his arm and she took it, surprised by the firmness of his escort. They walked through the conservatory, a glass and cast-iron dream where every flower in Christendom jostled for attention. Sir Cedric steered her expertly past the carnivorous plants, pausing only at the farthest corner, where an ornamental fountain babbled and the air was heady with the scent of orchids. He turned to her, all smiles. "You must think me forward, Miss Fairchild." "Not at all," she managed, though the back of her neck prickled. Sir Cedric folded his arms and leaned against the balustrade, his eyes narrowing with predatory ease. "I must admit to a curiosity, Miss Fairchild. You have a rare gift for evasion. At the last 3 assemblies, I have observed you, always in the periphery, never in the crush, and yet somehow at the very centre of things." She looked away, feigning interest in the orchids. "I am hardly the centre of anything, sir." He smiled. "Modesty becomes you, but I must tell you, I have a passion for puzzles." "Then you must be in raptures this season, what with the Nightingale and all." The words came out sharp, and she cursed herself for it. Sir Cedric only laughed. "Indeed, she is the obsession of the ton, but I find myself more intrigued by her imitators, those who think to dress as she does, hoping to catch the eye of fortune or fame." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I observed you at the last masquerade, Miss Fairchild." Lila's blood chilled. She tried to step back, but the marble edge of the fountain trapped her. "You wore a mask of midnight blue velvet," he continued, voice a velvet noose. "And there, just above your right temple, was a clever embroidery, a nightingale, rendered in silver thread. Quite singular. And at the corner, a teardrop of sapphire. It is a remarkable piece." She stared at the orchids, but they swam before her eyes. "I make a study of such details," he murmured. "A quirk, perhaps, but it has served me well. I have wagered with Lord Julian, in fact, that I might unmask the Nightingale before the Duke of Ravenshire does." At the mention of the Duke, Lila's hands curled into fists. Sir Cedric's expression softened, feigning embarrassment. "Please forgive me, Miss Fairchild. I do not mean to alarm you. I only wish to offer my assistance. There are many in London who would be less discreet should they discover what I have. Some might even seek advantage over your family or your sister's prospects. It is a dangerous game, this masquerade." He let the implication hang, heavy and cold. Lila forced her voice to steadiness. "If you wish to expose me, Sir Cedric, I cannot stop you, but I would hope you might find a better use for your cleverness." He shook his head, tutting. "You misjudge me. I am not your enemy." He stepped closer, until his breath brushed her cheek. "I would rather be your protector." She managed to laugh, brittle as a snapped stem. "I do not require a protector." He smiled, slow and terrible. Every woman does in the end, especially those with secrets. For a moment, she saw the boy he must have been, clever, cornered, determined to seize by force what gentler natures waited to earn. The realization made her skin crawl. He produced a card from his pocket, holding it between two fingers. "If you ever find yourself in need of advice or protection, you have only to send word." The card was thick, the engraving so fine it nearly shimmered. "I would not wish to see your reputation, your family's, come to harm." With that, he left her, vanishing into the greenhouse as efficiently as a snake in grass. Lila's legs nearly buckled. She stood for several minutes, willing her pulse to slow. The world resumed around her, indifferent. She returned to the drawing room, her smile fixed and her mind a nest of hornets. Vivienne greeted her with a wave of her fan. "There you are. I was beginning to worry you'd eloped with a botanist." "I have not the constitution," Lila replied, settling beside her sister. "Good. They say botanists are all perverts, obsessed with pistils and stamens." Vivienne made the joke for the benefit of her audience, but her hand found Lila's under the table and squeezed, as if to remind her that even in the jungle of Mayfair, one could find a fellow traveller. Lila squeezed back. She almost confessed it all, right there. The mask, the threat, the sharp edge of Sir Cedric's voice in the conservatory. But she could not bear to see Vivienne's bright certainty curdle into fear. Instead, she endured the rest of the afternoon in silence, counting down the minutes until she could retreat to her own room. By the time she reached her chamber, night had fallen, and the city beyond the window was a string of sullen lamps. Lila closed the door and pressed her forehead to the wood, letting herself feel the full weight of dread for the first time. She did not cry. She did not even shiver. She simply stood, hollowed out. The quiet was broken by a soft tap at the door. "Miss Lila?" Penelope's voice, gentle as always. "Come in." Penelope entered, closing the door behind her. She carried a tray with tea, the steam curling in the dim light. She placed it on the table and regarded Lila with her usual mix of discretion and affection. "You are upset," Penelope said, not a question. Lila nodded, then looked down at her hands. "Have you ever done something so reckless that you feared it might ruin everyone you loved?" Penelope poured the tea, not answering at once. When she spoke, her tone was thoughtful. "Most reckless acts, in my experience, are done out of longing, not malice." Lila sat on the bed, burying her face in her hands. "Sir Cedric has found me out. He knows I am the Nightingale. He threatened to expose me if I did not—" She faltered, shame choking the rest. Penelope's eyes narrowed. "If you did not, what?" "Marry him," Lila whispered. "He says he will keep my secret, if only I agree to—" She could not say it again. He made it sound as though he was saving me, but it felt like being bought and sold. Penelope set the tea aside, kneeling before Lila. She took both of Lila's hands in her own. "Listen to me. Men like Sir Cedric are always searching for leverage. It is the only way they feel powerful. If you give in to him, he will own you forever. If you resist, you may suffer, but at least you will be free." "What if he tells?" Lila asked, her voice so thin it barely survived the air. "What if everyone finds out?" Penelope's face was fierce, the face of a woman who had survived more than Lila could imagine. "Then you face it, with your head high. You have done nothing truly wrong, and you have allies. The Duke, he would not let you stand alone." The mention of the Duke sent a confusing heat through Lila's chest. She wanted to believe it, but what was love, or even affection, against the machinery of scandal? Penelope squeezed her hands harder. "You are brave, Miss Lila. It is the only thing I ever envied you." Lila laughed, but it was a laugh shaped like a sob. "I have never been brave." "Then practice," Penelope said. "Start now." They sat like that, in the hush of the small room, until Lila's breathing evened. Penelope brushed a stray curl from Lila's brow and pressed a cool hand to her cheek. "You are more than your secret," she said. "You are more than the mask." Lila nodded. The fear remained, but something else too. A resolve that felt like the first drop of rain after drought. She did not know how she would survive the next masquerade, but she knew now that she would face it as herself, even if it cost her everything. Down the corridor, the house echoed with the distant laughter of Vivienne and the brisk clatter of mothers arranging the day ahead. Life, it seemed, would go on as always. But in her room, Lila Fairchild shed the last of her illusions and let the Nightingale steel her heart for the storm to come. The Nightingale's final flight began, as these things often did, with a pair of borrowed gloves and a pulse drumming so loud it threatened to shatter every crystal in Mayfair. Lila stood in Penelope's attic, the blue gown unfurled and luminous as a dropped star, the mask in her trembling hands. They had made only the subtlest change to its design. The silver thread Nightingale now perched not on a bough, but on the fragile arch of the mask's own brow, as if to say, "Here I am, if you will have me." "It is a risk," Penelope had said, pinning Lila's hair with a hand as gentle as it was resolute. "But perhaps, sometimes, we must gamble on being loved as we are, not as we pretend to be." Lila had only nodded, speechless, her eyes stinging with terror and something perilously close to hope. The midnight masquerade this time was neither dream nor invitation to disaster. It was a battlefield, and every guest knew it. The house was ablaze with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and bruised roses. The hum of anticipation shivered in every corridor, carried in low, urgent voices. "Tonight, they say the Nightingale will be unmasked. The Duke has sworn to discover her, or never attend another ball. Lady Ashcombe has 100 guineas on the little French girl." Lila drifted through it all, her heart both hunter and quarry. Every face, every glance felt sharper, more searching. Even the footman seemed to know she was marked. Yet beneath the dread, an impossible freedom, she need not run any more. She would find the Duke, confess, and let the world do its worst. She reached the ballroom, where the night was already at full crescendo. Couples whirled in velvet and feather, masks glittered, and everywhere were watchers, hungry for the story's final, scandalous act. Lila felt them as a physical force, pressing her onward. She paused just inside the threshold, breath locked in her chest, and saw him at once. The Duke stood near the grand stair, a dark pillar in a sea of colour. Tonight he wore no mask at all, only the cold certainty of command and a black coat that fit as if stitched from storm cloud. He looked not at the dancers, but at the door, waiting. For her. She crossed the room, her slippered feet leaving no trace on the marble, and curtsied at a decorous distance. "Your Grace," she said, the mask giving her voice a resonance she did not feel. He inclined his head, his eyes never leaving her face. Nightingale. It was the first time he had addressed her so openly, the word carrying both accusation and benediction. She waited, willing herself to be steel. He said quietly, "I had begun to think you would not come." "I nearly did not," she answered, matching his candor. He let the silence linger, then took a step closer. "Do you know what they say will happen tonight?" She nodded. "They say I will be unmasked and ruined." His mouth curved, but it was not a smile. "They are rarely wrong, but sometimes they are very much so." She looked at him, feeling the words trembling on her tongue. "There is something I must tell you." But the Duke held up a hand, stopping her. "Let us not waste it on secrecy. Not tonight. Dance with me, Miss Rossignol." He used the name from her first invitation, and it was almost tender. The orchestra had just begun a new waltz, its opening notes as bracing as a slap. He took her hand with the lightest touch, leading her onto the floor. It was a dance unlike any they'd shared. The room seemed to recede, the crowd of onlookers dissolving into shadow. The Duke's hand at her back was steady, but she felt the tremor beneath it. For the first time, he did not try to steer her. He let her move as she wished, and she found herself bolder, looser, as if every footfall stamped a claim on the world. They circled once, twice, a third time, and Lila thought she could speak at last. "Your Grace," she began, but he pressed her hand and shook his head. "Not yet," he murmured, low enough for her alone. "One more circuit." It was then that Lila saw Sir Cedric Harrow at the edge of the dance floor, pale with anticipation, his eyes locked on her. He carried himself with the rigid, bristling poise of a man who had waited his entire life for this moment. She felt the hook of his gaze catch in her flesh, and stumbled. The Duke steadied her. "Who is it?" he whispered. She hesitated. "Sir Cedric. He means to expose me." The Duke's expression barely changed, but his grip tightened. "Let him try," he said, and there was such promise in the words that for a moment Lila forgot to be afraid. The music slowed, the dancers drew to a halt, and the room's attention flowed inexorably to the pair at the centre of the floor. Sir Cedric struck. He cut between them with the alacrity of a practiced duellist, his mouth fixed in a rictus of polite concern. "My Lord Duke, you will forgive the interruption, but I fear a grave deception has been perpetrated on us all." The crowd froze, the silence absolute. Sir Cedric turned to Lila, and his voice grew gentle, as if addressing a delirious child. "I beg your pardon, mademoiselle, but it is my duty to reveal the truth. You are not who you pretend to be. You are, in fact, Miss Lila Fairchild, daughter of Sir Augustus Fairchild and sister to the notorious Vivian." The accusation burst upon the room like a thunderclap. Lila stood very straight, unable to breathe. Sir Cedric advanced, voice trembling with righteous purpose. "You have used your mask to beguile us all. You have manipulated the highest echelons of society, but I can no longer permit such a charade to continue." He reached for her mask. The Duke's hand shot out, intercepting Sir Cedric's wrist before it touched her. She is not on trial, sir, the Duke said, his voice so measured it seemed to slow the very air. And if she were, I doubt you would be qualified to serve as judge or jury. Sir Cedric smiled, unfazed. I am only doing my duty. Indeed, the Duke replied. It is a curious duty that compels a man to humiliate a woman in public. I might have thought you had better things to do with your wit. Sir Cedric twisted his arm free. Do you deny it, then? Do you deny that this Nightingale is none other than Miss Fairchild? The Duke looked at Lila, his eyes asking the question he did not voice. She heard herself say, No, I do not deny it. There was a beat, a stillness so profound that Lila felt she might collapse into it. Sir Cedric seized his advantage. There, you see, she has confessed it. And yet you continue to champion her, my Lord Duke. The Duke did not look away from Lila. I do. And what of the scandal? What of the injury to your reputation, to your family name? The Duke smiled, a small, dangerous smile. I have survived far worse. As for my reputation, it was never in such danger as when I pretended to care for it. Sir Cedric's lips curled in contempt. You would marry a woman who has lied to your face? I would marry a woman, said the Duke, who has shown me the only truth worth knowing. He turned to Lila, and the world seemed to fade until there was only the two of them. Nightingale, he said, and there was so much tenderness in the word that it nearly undid her. Will you let me see you? As you are? Lila nodded, fingers shaking. She reached for the mask's ribbon, her hands clumsy with fear, but the Duke brushed them aside and untied it himself, with the delicacy of a surgeon or a lover. The mask fell. For the first time in her life, she stood unadorned before the world, with nothing between her and the eyes of everyone who had ever dismissed her as invisible, unremarkable, less. There was a long, astonished silence. Lady Ashcombe, the High Priestess of the Ton, gasped. Several others murmured, and then a wave of recognition passed through the crowd. It was not horror, or even outrage. It was wonder. She saw Vivienne, mouth agape, then curving into a slow, incredulous smile. She saw her mother, pale and trembling, but not fainting, not breaking. She saw the Duke, who looked at her as though he had won a kingdom. Sir Cedric tried once more, desperate. This is madness. She is nothing. She is everything, said the Duke, his voice loud and clear. And if you will not have the sense to see it, I suggest you take your objections elsewhere. He bowed to Sir Cedric with a finality that left no room for protest. Then he offered Lila his arm. For a moment, she hesitated, the sum of every warning and fear she had ever known pressing her back. But Penelope, somewhere in the crowd, met her gaze and gave the smallest of nods. Lila stepped forward, took the Duke's arm, and let the world move with her. The orchestra, uncertain, resumed its waltz. They danced, and as they turned, the crowd parted, bowing to the inevitable, or perhaps to the miracle that had just unfolded. Hours later, after the guests had gone and the ballroom lay empty, Lila found herself on the same marble balcony where her adventure had begun. She leaned on the cold rail, staring at the dark city, the wind sharp with spring and possibility. The Duke came to stand beside her. He did not speak, but his hand found hers, and together they watched the lights flicker on the river below. Lila thought of the mask, now abandoned. She thought of the years spent hiding, and of the single, impossible night when she had decided to step out and be seen. She turned to the Duke, searching his face for any trace of regret. He only smiled, and in the smile she saw every secret she had ever wished to share, every longing that had gone unsaid. "I cannot promise you safety," he said at last, his voice rough, "but I can promise you honesty and devotion and 1,000 nights brighter than this one." She laughed, unexpected and true. "I have never wished for safety," she said, "only for the chance to matter." He kissed her, not as a secret or a challenge, but as a certainty. And in that moment, Lila Fairchild, the Nightingale, knew she had won her freedom. Inside, the city slept, ignorant of the revolution that had just occurred in its midst. But on the balcony, beneath the indifferent stars, two souls held fast to each other and began the work of rewriting every story that had ever been written about who deserved to be seen and who deserved to be loved. The world, for once, could keep its silence. Chapter 9. The morning after the masquerade, London did what London always did with a scandal. It feasted. Lila woke to the sound of her mother's voice pitched somewhere between hysteria and triumph, 3 separate bouquets arriving before breakfast, and Vivienne perched at the foot of her bed like a magpie who has found something shinier than herself. "You are ruined," Vivienne announced, with the particular relish of a sister who does not, in fact, believe it. "Spectacularly, deliciously ruined." Lady Bertram fainted twice recounting it, and I am told the second faint was entirely for effect. "Am I ruined? Or am I engaged?" Lila asked, pulling the coverlet higher. "That," said Vivienne, "appears to be a matter of ongoing debate below stairs. Mother has changed her position 4 times since dawn." Penelope entered with the tea tray and a look that promised she alone had not lost her wits overnight. "His Grace has called," she said, "and Sir Augustus is currently deciding whether to receive him with a handshake or a horsewhip." Lila sat up so fast she nearly upended the tray. "Which is winning?" "The handshake," Penelope said, "marginally." It took the better part of the morning, and a great deal of her father's uncharacteristic firmness, before the matter was settled to everyone's satisfaction but Sir Cedric's, who was said to have left town by noon, and was not, by anyone's account, much missed. By the time the Duke of Ravenshire was shown into the drawing-room to speak with her father, Lila's fear had burned down to something steadier. Not safety, exactly, but the beginning of it. She did not hear what passed between the 2 men. She did not need to. When her father emerged, he looked at her for a long moment, searching, she thought, for the daughter he had always assumed was content to be overlooked, and said only, "He seems a sensible sort, for a duke," before retreating to his newspaper, visibly relieved to have the matter off his hands. It was, from her father, practically a benediction. A fortnight later, with the banns read and the wedding a matter of weeks rather than months, the Duke of Ravenshire took it upon himself to show his betrothed the conservatory at Ravenshire House, ostensibly because she had once confessed a fondness for orange trees, and actually because it was the one room in the great, echoing house where a chaperone's watchful eye could be evaded behind a sufficient quantity of greenery. Penelope, who had accompanied her, and had strong opinions about propriety, even when she herself was the one arranging its evasion, had made herself scarce somewhere among the ferns with the express instruction that she was not to be found for a quarter of an hour, and not a minute more. "A quarter of an hour," Lila said, watching the Duke close the glass door behind them with more care than the task strictly required. "She counts, you know. She has a very unforgiving sense of time." Then we had best not waste it in conversation. He crossed to her, unhurried, though the look in his eyes was anything but. Are you still afraid of me, Miss Fairchild? Terribly, she said, and did not step back. He touched her cheek, the same slow, reverent touch she remembered from the balcony, from the very first time he had looked at her as though she were worth memorizing. Good, he murmured. I should hate to think I'd grown dull. He kissed her then, unhurried in a way their stolen masquerade moments had never allowed, with all the certainty of a man who no longer had to wonder whether he was permitted. She sank into it, into him, into the particular, dizzying luxury of being wanted without secrecy, without a mask between them, without the whole of London holding its breath to see what she would do next. The orange trees kept their own counsel, the glass walls fogged faintly at the corners. Somewhere beyond the ferns, Penelope began, very deliberately, to hum. It was, Lila thought, the least subtle quarter of an hour of her entire life. She would not have traded a second of it. Chapter 10. Several weeks after the Nightingale's unmasking, London's appetite for scandal had not diminished, but its palate had grown more refined. What began as a delicious rumour, a duke bested by a wallflower and brought low by love, had blossomed into a narrative of the city's own making, polished in every retelling. The marriage was not yet formalized, but in the eyes of the ton, Lila Fairchild was already the next Duchess of Ravensshire, and her every move was dissected, admired, and, in at least one shocking case, imitated by an enterprising baronet's daughter with an unfortunately sallow complexion. If Lila had expected the aftermath to be a quiet exile, she was mistaken. She had never before been invited to so many teas, musicales, and carriage promenades in her entire life. It was, at times, overwhelming. But if Lila had learned anything from her campaign as the Nightingale, it was that a legend must never shrink from its own shadow. Today, the shadow was a masquerade. Her own. The grand halls of Ravensshire House were in tumult, servants rushing in an orchestrated confusion that bordered on the military, each bearing a garland, a candelabrum, or, in one memorable instance, a tray of candied violets large enough to supply an entire minor court. Lila stood at the centre of it all, her hair swept up, and her gown a creation so magnificent that even Vivienne had been forced to gasp. The seamstress had dubbed the shade moonlit indigo. Lila suspected the Duke himself had paid a fortune for the dye, which glimmered with undertones of midnight and sapphire. The sleeves were daringly bare, the bodice touched with embroidery so delicate that one required a magnifying glass to appreciate the full extent of the mischief. A pair of nightingales, so subtly rendered that only the sharpest observer would notice their presence. Miss Fairchild, if you stand in the window much longer, the neighbours will think you are signalling the start of an insurrection, Penelope said, appearing behind her with a box of invitations tied with a ribbon the exact shade of the gown's lining. Lila smiled, not moving from her post. Let them watch. It is their second favourite pastime. Penelope set the box on the table with the resigned dignity of a general deploying his troops. And the first? Gossip, of course, though the two are frequently the same thing. Penelope eyed her mistress with open fondness. You are changed, Miss Lila. You stand taller. My corset is much improved, Lila quipped, smoothing the fabric over her ribs. I think it is something else. Penelope stepped closer, lowering her voice. I have known you since you were no more than a wild thing in the hedgerow, Miss Lila. I know when you are pretending. She reached up and fixed a wisp of hair near Lila's temple. But now you are not pretending. Lila's smile wavered. She had been so many things these past months. A disappointment, a secret, a legend, a cautionary tale. But now, standing in the Duke's great house and preparing to face the world as herself, no mask, no alias, she felt something like peace. "I am trying to be brave." Penelope snorted. "You are terrifying." She gestured to the room, where two footmen were engaged in a philosophical dispute over the correct height for a rose garland. "They will speak of this night for years. And you—" Here she grinned, sly. "You will be the headline." "I would rather be the footnote," Lila confessed. "Not possible." Penelope's eyes danced. "You are the only reason any of them are coming." As if summoned by the threat of a compliment, Vivian drifted in, resplendent in a lilac confection that was, for once, not intended to outshine the occasion. Her lips were set in their familiar, supercilious bow, but there was something new in her expression, a softness, perhaps, or a recognition that the old rules had changed. "Lila," Vivian pronounced, "you are being summoned to the ballroom. The musicians wish to test the acoustics, and Mother has lost all patience with the flower arrangements. I believe the lilies are now vying for dominance with the hyacinths," Penelope reported. Vivian rolled her eyes. "Mother is threatening to lock the florist in the wine cellar." "That seems excessive," Lila observed. "She is threatening only the lower cellar. The Merlot is very sturdy." Vivian turned her attention to Lila's attire, her eyes sweeping up and down with the precision of a jeweler assessing a questionable diamond. "That dress is nearly indecent." Lila lifted her chin. The Duke had final approval. Vivian arched a brow. "Of course he did, but I did not expect you to outdo even yourself." Lila laughed, the sound lighter than she felt. "Neither did I." Vivian drew closer, hesitated, then reached out and squeezed Lila's hand. "If you wish to run away, now is the time. There is an alley behind the house. I am told it is perfect for dramatic escapes." "Thank you, dearest. I shall save it for emergencies." Lila squeezed her sister's hand in return. "Are you very cross?" Vivian pursed her lips, then shrugged. "I shall live. At least you are not marrying a cousin, or a poet." "Never a poet," Lila agreed, though she was reasonably certain her poetry career had just been preempted by her engagement. Vivian looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I am proud of you, and if you ever tell anyone I said so, I will deny it until my dying breath." Noted. Satisfied, Vivian swept from the room, leaving a faint trail of lavender and resolve. The ballroom, when Lila entered, was a marvel. The floor gleamed, the chandeliers had been polished to a merciless dazzle, and the garlands, despite the florist's bickering, had achieved a state of suspended elegance along every arch and pillar. Musicians in sombre black tuned their instruments with the solemnity of priests at a coronation. At the far end of the room, the Duke of Ravenshire stood with his steward, reviewing a list of names that surely included every family in London and several from the provinces for good measure. He looked up the moment Lila appeared, his face lighting with a pride that made her throat tighten. He dismissed the steward with a word and crossed to her, offering his arm. "Miss Fairchild," he said, voice soft enough for her alone, "you are in danger of starting a riot." Lila grinned. "It is what you hired me for, is it not?" He drew her closer, careful of propriety, but not so careful as to avoid the gentle press of her hand to his sleeve. "I have considered, in retrospect, that you may be the ruin of my entire house." I shall try not to bankrupt you before the wedding." He bent his head, voice pitched low. "Ruin is a small price for such reward." She blushed, which only amused him more. "Do you enjoy seeing me embarrassed, Your Grace?" "Immensely." He looked at her in that way he had, the one that saw past every mask, every defense. "But tonight, you are not allowed to hide. Not from me, and not from yourself." She swallowed. "Does it frighten you?" He shook his head. "Not any more." He guided her to the center of the floor, nodding to the musicians, who began a tentative, stately waltz. "Dance with me." She hesitated, conscious of the assembled staff and the two maids fussing over table settings near the far wall. "If I must be spectacle, let it be for the right reason," he said, and spun her into the dance before she could object. They moved through the empty room, alone, but not unobserved. Every turn, every step was a promise. To herself, to him, to the impossible future she had once only dared to write about in secret. "Are you ready for tonight?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "I do not think I will ever be ready, but I am willing to try." He smiled, slow and fierce. "I have never been more certain of anything." They finished the circuit. He paused, still holding her, and leaned in. "You will be the finest duchess this house has ever known." She tried to laugh it off, but found herself overwhelmed. For a long moment, she simply stood there, letting the music, the light, and the man before her wash away every last shadow of doubt. "Thank you," she whispered. He pressed her hand to his lips. "You need never thank me for seeing what was always there." A commotion at the door signaled the arrival of the first guests, their voices echoing down the marble corridor. Lila looked to the Duke. "Is it time?" "It is your world now, Miss Fairchild. Lead the way." She took a breath, set her shoulders, and strode forward, ready to be seen. As the doors opened, the Duke fell into step beside her, their arms nearly but not quite entwined. The world beyond was a torrent of music, colour, and possibility. And for the first time, Lila did not shrink from it. She walked into the night, the very centre of the world she had once feared, and did not look back. The masquerade at Ravenshire House was not merely an event, it was a phenomenon. Within the first hour, it had achieved a density of gossip so intense that several guests were observed to swoon, though one could never be certain, in such company, whether a feint was genuine or simply the only available means of redirecting the narrative to oneself. Lila had attended balls before, of course, but never one where she was the subject of every glance, the reason for every whispered aside, the pivot about which the night revolved. She would have been terrified, if not for the outlandish joy of it all. The house had never looked finer. Chandeliers burned with the hunger of 1,000 stars, their light sending the mosaic tiles of the ballroom into a frenzy of shifting patterns. Every surface was decked in roses. They twined up the banisters, clambered over the gilded mirrors, spilled from urns in the antechambers. The air was thick with their scent, undercut by candle smoke and the sharper tang of anticipation. Lila entered on the Duke's arm and felt the world ripple in response. For a heartbeat, there was silence, as if all of London had agreed to hold its collective breath. Then the crowd surged forward, a crush of colours and feathers and masks. So many masks, each more outlandish than the last. The hostess of the evening, Lady Agatha herself, stood at the apex of the stair, her mask an ornate confection of purple and silver that did nothing to soften her predatory gaze. "Miss Fairchild," Lady Agatha intoned, her voice a whip-crack of approval, "you have outdone us all." Lila curtsied, aware that every eye was on her. "Thank you, Lady Agatha. It is said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." The dowager's lips twitched. "Tonight, imitation is the sincerest form of desperation?" She tilted her head, appraising the Duke. "And you, Ravenshaw, have you prepared a speech for the occasion?" "Only a single line," the Duke replied, unruffled. "But it will be delivered at midnight, and only if the crowd is sufficiently drunk to appreciate my wit." Lady Agatha barked a laugh, then swept away, leaving a trail of admirers in her wake. Lila and the Duke made their way into the ballroom, where the musicians, discreetly, expertly, swelled their opening number to mark the couple's arrival. The crowd parted for them, and for the first time since she could remember, Lila felt not invisible, but incandescent. "Does it ever become less strange?" she murmured, leaning close. "Never," the Duke said, his lips grazing her ear. "But that is half the fun." He led her onto the floor, and the dance began. This time, there was no secrecy, no calculated risk. Every step was a declaration. "Here we are. Let them look." They spun, they dipped, and Lila discovered that the world could be both dizzy and steady at the same time. The Duke's hand on her waist was an anchor, the hush of his breath at her temple a promise. Around them, the other dancers orbited like minor moons, their curiosity edged with envy. Halfway through the set, Vivian glided past, her mask a riot of lilac and pearls, her smile wicked. "You are making us all look bad, Lila," she stage-whispered, loud enough for the neighbouring couples to hear. "I can only hope," Lila whispered back. Vivian squeezed her hand as they turned, and for the first time in months, the gesture was simple, uncomplicated affection. "Is it as you dreamed?" the Duke asked later, as they took a breath at the edge of the floor. "It is more," Lila admitted. "I never thought I would be the person everyone watched." He leaned in, eyes bright behind his own understated mask. "Then let them. You deserve every glance." Penelope appeared at Lila's elbow, carrying a glass of lemonade and a note of conspiracy in her gaze. "You are being summoned to the terrace, Miss Lila. Lady Agatha says she will not rest until you have explained the origin of your mask." Lila raised a brow. "It is not enough to simply wear it?" "Not for Lady Agatha," Penelope replied, a droll twinkle in her eye. "She believes there is a secret in every stitch. She is determined to uncover yours before sunrise." The Duke laughed, low and fond. "Go. I will hold the fort." Lila excused herself, stepping into the cool hush of the terrace. The city sprawled beneath her, a sea of lanterns and secrets. The air was crisp, and for the first time all evening she felt alone with her thoughts. She leaned on the rail, inhaling the scent of roses, the music drifting up from the ballroom. For a moment, she was transported back to the days of the first mask, the borrowed courage, the fear of discovery. How strange it was to find herself longing for that uncertainty, even as she basked in the safety of the Duke's devotion. A voice, soft but unmistakable, broke her reverie. "I thought you might have flown away." She turned to find him there, silhouetted by candlelight, his mask now discarded. He was beautiful, and utterly hers. "I was only thinking," she said, voice shy. about how quickly everything can change. He joined her at the balustrade, his hand covering hers. "Do you regret it?" "Not a single second." He smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that made her weak. "Nor do I." They stood together in silence, the world below a distant, irrelevant thing. After a while, she said, "Do you think they will ever stop talking about us?" "I sincerely hope not. Otherwise, we shall be forced to cause another scandal." She laughed, pressing her face to his shoulder. "I think I have retired from the scandal business. I should like to be ordinary for a while." He cupped her cheek, turning her to face him. "You could never be ordinary. Not even if you tried." She blinked away the threat of tears. "I am afraid I shall disappoint you, eventually." He shook his head, gentle. "Lila, if I wanted the ordinary, I would have married an earl's daughter or a duchess's niece. I wanted you, and every day you surprise me anew." She let herself believe it, just for this moment. He kissed her, slow and thorough, the kind of kiss that rewrote every fear she had ever known. "Promise me something," she said, when at last they parted. "Anything. That we will always be honest, even when it is terrifying, even when it is scandalous." He smiled, fierce and true. "Especially then." She wrapped her arms around his waist, and for the first time, she felt not simply brave, but invincible. They stood together, wrapped in each other, and the scent of 100,000 roses as the music floated up from below and the stars pressed close overhead. Inside, the masquerade raged on. But out here, beneath the indifferent heavens, Lila Fairchild, soon to be Duchess of Ravenshire, let go of every mask she had ever worn and trusted that she would be loved as she was for all the days to come. At midnight, as promised, the Duke delivered his speech. It was a single line, but it echoed in Lila's mind long after the guests had gone and the candles had guttered. "To the Nightingale who taught me to sing," he said, raising his glass, "and to every woman who has ever longed to be seen, may we never look away." Lila stood beside him, head high, and did not look away either. The world could keep its stories. She would write her own. And this, she thought, as the Duke's hand closed around hers, was only the beginning. Epilogue. The gardens at Ravenshire House had never been designed with picnics in mind. The head gardener, a dour Scot named Fenwick, had opinions about grass stains that bordered on the theological. But on a bright July afternoon, some 8 months after a certain masquerade had scandalized half of London, they hosted one anyway. Lila, Duchess of Ravenshire for exactly 11 weeks, sat beneath the old oak with her skirts arranged in a manner that would have horrified her mother, and a smear of strawberry jam on one glove that would have horrified her further, and decided she did not care about either. "You are not listening," Vivienne accused, waving a half-eaten scone for emphasis. "I said the man had the audacity, to tell me my brushwork lacked discipline. I informed him that discipline was for soldiers and governesses, and promptly bought the painting out from under him at auction." "Did you like the painting?" Lila asked. "Not remotely, but I liked winning." Vivienne had taken, this past season, to patronizing struggling artists with the same ferocity she had once reserved for suitors, and while their mother despaired of ever seeing her married, Lila privately thought her sister had never looked happier. "You are smiling at me in that insufferable way again." "I am not." "You are. It is very smug for a woman who spent 4 years hiding behind pillars." I contain multitudes, Lila said serenely, and Vivienne threw a bit of scone at her, which missed, and struck Penelope instead. I have been hit by pastry, Penelope observed, without looking up from the accounts book balanced on her knee. In better households than this one, but not many. She had stayed on after the wedding, not, as she'd informed Lila with some asperity, out of sentiment, but because no one else in London understood how the Duchess of Ravenshire's correspondence, wardrobe, and general campaign of terror against the Ton's assumptions ought to be run, and she was not about to trust the job to a stranger. She managed the household now with the same brisk, unbothered competence she had once managed a masquerade, and the staff, Lila was reliably informed, were faintly afraid of her. It suited her. You are still cross about the scone, Vivienne said. I am cross about the scone, and the accounts, and the fact that your mother has written 4 times this week, asking whether I might persuade you toward Lord Bellwether, who I understand has both a fortune and a face like a disappointed spaniel. Absolutely not, said Vivienne with feeling. My thoughts precisely, said Penelope, and returned to her ledger. Lila watched them bicker with the particular contentment of a woman who had once believed herself invisible, and found she no longer had to remind herself that this, the noise, the jam, the ordinary, unremarkable joy of an afternoon that no one was watching, was real. Across the lawn, the Duke had abandoned whatever business had occupied him that morning, and was walking toward them with his coat over one shoulder and his sleeves rolled in a manner that would have caused a minor riot at any ball in Mayfair. He caught her eye and did not hurry his step, which was, she had learned, his particular way of telling her he had nowhere else in the world he would rather be. You have jam on your glove, he said when he reached her. I am aware. I find I do not mind it. He settled beside her on the grass, entirely without ducal dignity, and accepted the scone Vivienne offered as a peace gesture. Fenwick will have something to say about the state of his lawn? Fenwick, said Lila, has been saying something about the state of his lawn since April. I have stopped listening. A skill you perfected on me first, as I recall. You were very tiresome in the beginning. I was besotted, he corrected, which I am given to understand looks much the same from the outside. He took her jam-stained hand without apparent concern for his own sleeve and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, and if it lingered rather longer than strict propriety allowed, there was no one present inclined to remark on it. Are you happy, Lila Fairchild? Ravenshire, she corrected. And insufferably so. Good. He looked at her the way he had that first night at the masquerade, as though she were the only interesting thing in a room full of candlelight and pretense, except that now there was no mask between them, and had not been for a long while. Then I have done my one useful piece of work in this world. Only the one? I am told the House of Lords disagrees. I choose not to believe them. Vivienne groaned theatrically and threw another piece of scone, which this time struck its intended target squarely on the nose, and the Duke of Ravensshire, who had once made half of London tremble with a single arched eyebrow, laughed until he had to lie back in the grass to recover, and Lila laughed with him, and somewhere beyond the oak tree, the gardener could be heard beginning, with weary resignation, to mourn his lawn. It was, all things considered, exactly the sort of afternoon she had never once let herself imagine, back when she was a girl behind a pillar with a secret notebook and a longing she couldn't name. She had wanted, once, only to be seen. She had not known then how much better it would be to also be known, jam-stained and unguarded, and entirely herself, by people who had no interest in looking away. The end. And so, behind one mysterious mask, a love story began that neither the Duke nor Lila could have expected. Thank you for listening to the Duke's Mysterious Masquerade. If this story captured your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more unforgettable romance. Your escape into romance awaits. Happy listening.